April 9th, 1870. In Tucson, Arizona Territory, the Weekly Arizonian came off the press with a claim that cut straight through exhaustion and caution. The paper described a spectacular mining discovery in the Pyramid Mountains of New Mexico, and the wording sounded settled, as if debate was already finished. By midday, men with cracked hands held the sheet close so the wind would not tear it away. They read the lines twice, then passed the paper to the next man without folding it, afraid that a crease meant bad luck, or that hesitation meant losing a fortune to a faster rival. The printing office did not need a traveling salesman. The message carried itself into the territory's daily traffic. A miner repeated the claim in a saloon where the air smelled of tobacco and spilled whiskey. A storekeeper mentioned it while weighing flour and beans for a customer who kept glancing toward the door, already imagining a departure. A stage driver tucked the paper into his coat and showed it at the next station where fresh horses waited, and within hours the rumor had taken on extra details, bigger numbers, clearer certainty, and a tighter timetable. The way frontier talk always sharpened when money might be hiding inside it. Outside Tucson, the land that held these promises also held the penalties for believing too quickly. Dry country demanded planning and punished pride. Water was counted in canteens and barrels. Horses were fed with care because a dead horse meant a man walked. Heat cracked lips and split skin. Night cold stiffened clothing and turned shallow sleep into waking shivers. Roadside graves appeared without ceremony, a mound of earth, a scatter of stones, and no marker beyond the memory of whoever had been forced to move on. Mining camps across Arizona and New Mexico territories lived inside that wager every day. Many camps were nothing more than scattered tents, brush lean-tos, and plank shanties arranged around a shallow dig or a ridge of broken rock. The food was basic: flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and whatever meat a rifle could take. The air smelled of sweat, wood smoke, and blasting powder. Men worked with fingers cut by quartz edges and burned by lye soap that never removed the grime. When ore failed to appear, hunger arrived fast, and hunger made men borrow, then steal, then leave in the night. The April headline fed a broader pattern that had become familiar by 1870. Newspapers, prospectuses, and excited letters promised the next big strike, and money hurried toward the promise while facts lagged behind. A new claim could be traded several times in a week, because ownership on paper mattered more to speculators than the reality of ore underfoot. Investors who lived far from the diggings relied on other people's descriptions. They relied on an assay report, a confident letter, a map drawn by a man who owned nothing but a pencil. When the promise collapsed, the paper still existed, and that paper became a weapon in courtrooms and backrooms. San Francisco turned that pattern into an engine. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed in May 1869, and the speed it introduced changed the behavior of every ambitious man on the Pacific coast. A report from a remote camp could reach the city quickly enough to spark a meeting while the original discoverers were still packing their tools. Telegraph wires carried short summaries that removed hesitation and kept only excitement. Railroad timetables turned long-distance travel into a planned act instead of a gamble, and planned acts invited more money because they looked controlled. The city also ran on mining shares the way a mill runs on feed. Men crowded into brokerage rooms where shouted prices and chalk marks turned rumor into numbers. A claim in Nevada or Idaho could be represented by paper certificates passed hand to hand, and those certificates could rise or crash within a single day. When a mine needed funds, owners issued assessments, demands for more money from shareholders, and men who could not pay watched their stakes shrink or disappear. In that system, being early mattered more than being correct, because early meant cheaper shares and louder bragging rights. Newspapers amplified the rhythm. Editors understood that a new strike headline sold copies, and sensational language brought readers even when details were thin. The Telegraph shortened stories into sharp claims that raced ahead of correction. By the time a sober report arrived, the first wave of money often had already moved, and men who had committed capital defended their decision with stubborn pride. The mechanism did not require a conspiracy. It required competition, and San Francisco competed as if hesitation were fatal. By 1870, San Francisco held 150,000 people pressed between the bay and the hills. The waterfront hummed with manual labor. Ships loaded and unloaded under a constant soundtrack of shouted orders, creaking rigging, and the slap of water against pilings. Rope fibers, tar, coal soot, and fish slime mixed into a smell that stayed on clothing. Drays and wagons rattled along with crates, barrels, lumber, and sacks of grain. In the business district, a different labor continued under gaslight. Clerks copying figures into ledgers, brokers carrying messages between offices, and messengers running upstairs with envelopes that could turn into fortunes or into lawsuits. Banks and brokerage rooms stood between those two brutalities. They were the places where mining stories became instruments, loans, shares, leases, and contracts. The Bank of California dominated that world. Its counters and vaults represented safety in a region where safety was never guaranteed. The bank also represented power. A man who could not get credit there often could not get credit anywhere that mattered. Diamonds carried a special charge in that culture because they were not tied to one American region in the public mind. Gold meant rivers and sluices. Silver meant tunnels and stamp mills. Diamonds suggested a harder, cleaner form of wealth that could be carried in a pocket and taken across borders without wagon loads of ore. Even industrial diamonds carried that aura to anyone who did not know the difference. The word implied permanence, prestige, and a kind of miracle that could outshine every Western metal story that had already burned men out. William Chapman Ralston, the bank's founder, operated with the confidence of a man who believed the West could be organized by will. He had profited from Nevada's silver wealth at the Comstock lode and understood that a boom enriched more than the miners. A mine needed equipment, timber, powder, rails, tools, food, transport, and payroll. Whoever controlled credit and supply lines could profit even if a mine disappointed, because debt still demanded payment. That knowledge made Ralston receptive to big stories, and it made men around him chase the next deal with a seriousness that looked like wisdom. During this period, Ralston and Associates promoted a New Mexico venture called the Mountains of Silver. The Pyramid Mountains were described as a place where ore would pour out as soon as capital arrived. In the wake of the Tucson newspaper claim, the promotion gained a sharper edge. Men who heard the April story pictured a region loaded with hidden wealth, and that picture helped shares change hands in cities far from the desert. In promotional talk, the mine was already a success. The only remaining task was to organize money quickly enough to seize it. The West also carried a kind of violence that made secrecy valuable. Mining territory involved disputes over land, over water, and over the right to dig. In many places, law was a distant concept enforced only when a marshal had enough men behind him. Prospectors traveled with rifles because robbery targeted anyone suspected of carrying money or minerals. A man who claimed to have found a rich deposit invited attention that could become deadly. And even in a civilized city, a rumor could put thieves on a trail. On the frontier, even legitimate wealth could be taken by force or trick. Claim jumpers watched for tired men who could not defend a stake day and night. A prospector who left to buy supplies could return to find another name posted on his ground. Disputes turned into fistfights, then into gunfire, then into hurried burials. Committees of citizens sometimes replaced courts, and a rope could be thrown over a beam in minutes when a crowd decided a man had stolen too much. These realities trained people to guard information, and that habit of guardedness later became an excellent disguise for men who hid a fraud behind the language of self-protection. Philip Arnold watched all of this from an angle that gave him leverage. Arnold was a Kentuckian with limited schooling, a veteran of the Mexican War, and a man who had chased gold in California after the rush of 1849. His life ran through the practical world of mines and camps where men learned quickly that appearance mattered and that talk could be used as a tool. He returned at intervals to Kentucky, bought a farm, married, and started a family. Then he returned west again and entered San Francisco's industrial world, close to money and close to mining, but not close enough to be rich. Arnold worked as an assistant bookkeeper for the Diamond Drill Company, a firm that built drills fitted with diamond-tipped bits. Those bits were not jewelry. They existed to chew through rock, cut cores from hard ground, and deliver a clean column of evidence from deep under the surface. Industrial diamonds were the teeth that made those machines valuable. They were handled as supplies, ordered, counted, stored, and issued. A man who kept books saw where they were kept, how they were recorded, and how easy it was for a small amount of high-value material to move without attracting the kind of attention that gold or cash would bring. The drill shop itself was loud and dirty in a different way than a mine. Iron rang against iron, belts turned overhead. Oil and metal filings clung to benches. In one corner, bits waited to be set or repaired, their tips holding tiny stones that could bite rock harder than steel could. The diamonds were small, practical, and handled without romance. They could be weighed, counted, and signed for like bolts or bearings, and that ordinary handling dulled the caution that a jeweler would have brought. For a man watching the supply chain from behind a desk, the stones were not rare wonders, they were simply valuable pieces that worked. Arnold paid attention to those stones with the same intensity other men gave to gold dust. He read technical discussions of diamonds, their properties, and the ways they were identified. The reading gave him vocabulary and confidence. It also revealed a social weakness he could exploit. Most investors did not know what a rough diamond looked like. Many knew only the finished jewel under glass. A man who could lay a handful of uncut stones on a desk could create authority by forcing his listener to admit ignorance, and once a listener admitted ignorance, pride often demanded that the ignorance be covered by quick action. Arnold assembled his proof with care. Uncut industrial diamonds went into a leather bag, irregular stones valued for hardness even when they were too flawed for fine cutting. He then added garnets, rubies, and sapphires purchased from Indians in Arizona. The mix created a messy assortment of color and hardness that looked like it had been scooped from the earth rather than purchased in a shop. It also created confusion in anyone who lacked geological training. Variety looks like abundance, and abundance looks like a field rich enough to justify risk. Arnold chose his partner with the same care he gave the bag. John Slack was his older cousin, another Kentuckian, another Mexican War veteran, and another man who had gone west in the era when gold drew crowds across continents. Slack's demeanor served the fraud. He acted listless and taciturn. He let Arnold do the talking. In private rooms, Slack's silence created weight, as if words were dangerous and the secret too valuable for casual conversation. Slack's presence also protected Arnold from looking like a lone storyteller, because two men carrying the same claim felt less like a scheme and more like a discovery shared in hardship. The pair prepared the visible details that shaped first impressions. They needed to look like men who had traveled hard. They needed dust on their boots and wear in their clothing. They needed faces that carried sun and wind. In a city where many confidence men wore clean coats and carried rehearsed smiles, travel-stained prospectors could feel honest simply by contrast. Their manner also mattered. They spoke in short bursts, held back details, and allowed irritation to rise when pushed, which made their restraint look like fear of being robbed, not fear of being questioned. The next decision was the selection of a first listener, and it required knowledge of how San Francisco's money world worked. A miner in a saloon could not supply capital or prestige. A jeweler would demand direct proof and ask questions that created trails. The first listener needed money, connections, and a personality trained to move quickly. George D. Roberts fit those needs. Roberts was a San Francisco financier and mine broker, comfortable with mineral talk and willing to gamble on it. He moved in the part of the city where private deals were routine. Roberts also offered a practical advantage. Arnold had once worked for Roberts as a prospector, and that prior connection created an entry point. A familiar face reduced the sense of risk. Familiarity also made it easier to demand confidentiality without sounding absurd. A stranger asking for secrecy sounded like a trap. A former associate asking for secrecy could sound like a man protecting both parties. Arnold and Slack shaped their approach around the Bank of California because the bank's name implied real value. Their story needed a reason why they carried the bag into a broker's office instead of placing it in a vault. They chose the late hour as their lever. After banking hours, the bank's doors were shut. After banking hours, a man carrying something valuable needed another refuge. The late hour added tension, suggested danger, and pressured Roberts to make decisions without the calming effect of daylight and public witnesses. Late in November 1870, they waited until business traffic had thinned, and the city's public rooms filled with dinner conversations instead of transactions. They walked to Roberts's office with the leather bag held close. They avoided calling attention to themselves. They did not hire a public carriage that a driver would. Remember, they kept their eyes moving and their speech minimal. Men with a secret survive by acting as if they have none. The hallway outside Roberts's office carried the stale smell of an older building, wood, dust, and linseed oil. Light leaked from the edges of the door. Inside, the day's clerks were gone, leaving a private room where papers and a safe represented ownership more than any physical product. Arnold knocked once, short and firm. Roberts opened the door and saw two men who did not match the city's polished rhythm. Slack stood heavy and silent, eyes dull with fatigue or performance. Arnold held the bag and spoke with clipped urgency. The Bank of California had been closed, he said, and the bag could not be kept on their persons through the night. Roberts stepped back, and the two men crossed the threshold. The door shut behind them with a soft final sound, and the lie, built from industrial stones and frontier appetite, entered a room where money listened. December 1870. In London, Asbury Harpending worked inside rooms heated by coal and crowded with paper where men measured distant mountains using ink, seals, and confidence. He was there to raise British money for the Mountains of Silver venture in New Mexico's Pyramid Mountains, an enterprise already promoted in American newspapers and discussed in San Francisco circles. The documents in front of him promised organization and profit, but every meeting in London turned on the same hard problem: the gap between printed certainty and the ground itself. The work Harpending was doing carried a fresh warning. The Mountains of Silver story had already shown how quickly a public announcement could outpace reality. In April of the previous year, a Tucson newspaper had proclaimed that the greatest treasures on the continent had been found in the Pyramid Mountains. Bankers hurried in, miners claimed stakes, investors sought capital in distant cities, and surveyors laid out a town. The venture then failed to produce enough silver for a single belt buckle. Harpending still had to sell it because the machine of speculation did not stop for disappointment. It simply searched for a sharper hook. Harpending's days followed a grinding pattern. He crossed soot-stained streets to visit brokers, then returned to answer letters that arrived in steady piles. He met men in private offices where heavy curtains blocked out daylight, and he listened to cautious voices asking for guarantees that did not exist. He knew that British investors had heard too many colonial mining stories that ended in lawsuits and unpaid dividends. He also knew that the fear of missing the next windfall could override prudence when the right rumor landed in the right room. That rumor reached him through a cablegram, short enough to be expensive and blunt enough to carry urgency. It came from San Francisco by way of the Atlantic cable and the telegraph wires that ran across England. The message did not read as a promoter's prospectus. It read as a secret that had already moved beyond control. George D. Roberts, the San Francisco mine broker who had first been shown rough stones by Philip Arnold and John Slack, signaled that the matter was too large to handle quietly without bringing in heavier men. Harpending understood what made the story dangerous and what made it irresistible. Diamonds had already moved from legend into commerce in the last decade, with widely reported finds in South Africa, and the thought of a comparable discovery in the American interior captured attention shaped by decades of gold and silver rushes. Men who had watched fortunes rise at Sutter's Mill and the Comstock had learned a hard lesson. Hesitation could cost everything. Harpending also understood that the same rumor, if it escaped the wrong mouth in London, could travel outward and invite competitors to act. He read the cablegram more than once, then began measuring what it would cost him to abandon his London work. The mountains of silver promotion demanded attention, and British capital could disappear the moment it sensed uncertainty. Yet a diamond field, if real, would eclipse a silver mine in public interest and in potential returns. In the London he moved through, rumors were traded with the same enthusiasm as shares, and even a whisper that Californian financiers had proof of gems could travel outward and invite competitors to act. He took care with his replies. He used guarded language, avoided precise terms in written form, and asked for details that could be sent through safer channels. The cables themselves were fast, but they were not private in the way a man wished them to be. Operators handled messages, clerks logged receipts, and curious eyes could see patterns even when words were concealed. Harpending kept the focus on timing and travel, not on stones, and he began arranging his return passage. While Harpending prepared to cross the ocean, the affair in San Francisco advanced through a second, calculated step. Arnold and Slack did not rely on the first handful of stones alone. They brought more, and they brought it with a story designed to answer the central question their marks had already identified: whether the discovery was a rare pocket or a deposit large enough to justify an enterprise. They claimed they had gone back to the hidden location and returned with a far greater collection. The claim was measured in weight and money. 60 pounds of diamonds and rubies, they said, worth $600,000. The weight implied volume, a burden a man would have to guard with his life on bad roads and through country where robbery was common and murder was seldom punished. The value implied not a single lucky stone, but a field that could be worked, controlled, and sold to the world as a national marvel. The stones themselves, whatever their grade, were real enough to defeat the simplest doubts, and that reality gave the lie room to grow. Roberts used a jeweler's confirmation as his shield. He said a local jeweler had authenticated the stones. The jeweler did not have to vouch for origin, only for the nature of what lay in the sack. A rough diamond did not present itself as a polished jewel, but it carried distinctive hardness and crystalline form. Rubies and sapphires could be judged by color and internal character. Even flawed stones, even industrial stones, could still be precious stones. The presence of genuine material allowed Roberts to speak with confidence without ever proving where the material came from. The confirmation also served Roberts' own position. It let him justify widening the circle without appearing reckless. He approached men whose fortunes were tied to mining and finance, men who understood extraction and speculation, and who also understood that rivals could outbid them if they moved too slowly. William Lent entered the group, a San Francisco mining entrepreneur with experience from earlier booms. General George S. Dodge was brought in as well, a former Union Army officer who had shifted into mining and finance. Their entry changed the tone of the scheme, and it changed the pressure applied to the two prospectors. The meetings that followed were held where servants and clerks could be controlled. Doors were shut and checked, windows were covered. In a city built on rumor, secrecy required habits that made men look guilty even when they believed they were simply being prudent. Those habits also created a sense of exclusivity that fed the desire they were trying to restrain. Each man in the room could feel the value of the secret rising simply because other wealthy men did not yet have it. The investors wanted one result that would make all later steps possible: control of the discovery. They did not trust Arnold and Slack to remain loyal once the field became a public prize. They also did not want their capital tied up in a partnership with two men whose instincts were shaped by prospecting rather than boardrooms. A buyout became the central goal. The discoverers would be paid and pushed aside, and the men with money would hold the field through claims and corporate structure. Arnold managed the room with an instinct that appeared as caution and restraint. He did not rush to accept offers. He acted as if wealth frightened him more than it excited him, and he spoke of travel in country where a man could disappear. He insisted that the location had to remain hidden until the investors were ready to control it. Slack stayed near the same posture: less talk, more silence, more irritation when questioned. Their differing styles worked together. Arnold supplied explanations. Slack supplied resistance. Both of them supplied the only proof the investors could hold: stones that were real. The investors pressed for terms that would bind the two men. They wanted a promise of inspection and a promise of exclusive dealing. They also wanted a structure that would prevent Arnold and Slack from taking the first payment and disappearing. Slack delivered the price that ended the first stage of negotiation. He asked $100,000 for his share, divided into two payments: $50,000 immediately and $50,000 after the pair made what they described as another visit to the field. Inside the circle, the demand was discussed as arithmetic. If the second sack truly represented a field that could yield $600,000 in stones from a single recovery, then $100,000 to secure rights could be framed as a bargain. The men did not speak of being fooled. They spoke of being first. They spoke of claims, corporate charters, mining engineers, lawyers, and how to keep a discovery quiet long enough to hold the ground. They also spoke of the violence a public rush would bring, because in the West of that year, a new mineral story did not stay inside offices. The paperwork that emerged treated the deal as a property transfer rather than a wager. It created signatures the investors could later point to in court. It gave Arnold and Slack language that implied respect because it was safer to keep them convinced they were being treated fairly. The arrangement still left one problem unresolved. The location remained locked inside Arnold's and Slack's control. Yet the men with money accepted that risk because the stones in their hands had pushed them beyond simple curiosity, and because pride now sat beside greed in the same chair. During this period, secrecy became its own discipline. Every new participant made the secret harder to hold and made the men inside it more suspicious of everyone around them. They stopped speaking freely, even among themselves. They began meeting in places where they controlled who entered and who listened. They avoided leaving written traces beyond what was necessary for contracts. The more they tried to protect their advantage, the more the secret shaped their daily behavior. At the same time, the city beyond their closed doors continued to grind. Stevedores hauled cargo along the waterfront. Teamsters moved barrels and crates through streets lined with warehouses. Men with calloused hands spent wages on cheap food and hard liquor, while the wealthy purchased art, built homes on hills, and financed distant enterprises with signatures alone. In that environment, a diamond rumor carried intensity. It promised a new kind of wealth that seemed cleaner than gold dust and faster than deep quartz mining, and it promised it to men who already believed the West owed them another fortune. In May of 1871, Harpending arrived back in San Francisco, having traveled from London as quickly as steamship and railroad could deliver him. The journey demanded endurance. Shipboard air below deck carried oil, damp fabric, and human breath. After landing, rail travel added coal smoke, cinders, and sleepless nights in cramped cars. By the time he reached the bay, he carried fatigue that sharpened rather than dulled his attention, because he could sense that decisions had been made in his absence. He went straight into the meetings that mattered. Ralston, Roberts, Lent, and Dodge laid out what they had been told, what they had seen, and what they intended to do. Harpending listened to the claim of the 60-pound sack and to the detail that a jeweler had confirmed the stones. He did not dismiss the story, because he had already learned in the mining world that fraud often began with a real sample. He also did not accept it without probing, because he had watched confidence men use just enough truth to open a man's wallet. The discussion in those rooms focused on control. Ralston's instinct was not merely to invest but to organize, to turn a secret into a managed enterprise. Harpending's instinct was similar, but he pressed discipline in communication because he understood how quickly a discovery could leak into newspapers and force premature exposure. He emphasized the need to keep rivals from hearing the story until the investors had a legal path to hold the ground. The men agreed on the immediate point. Arnold and Slack had to be bound by paper and money before they could sell the same secret elsewhere. The negotiators returned to Slack's price. Harpending could hear the desire in the room, but he could also hear the fear beneath it. If the investors refused, Arnold and Slack could carry the same secret to another set of men. If they agreed too easily, they risked paying for stones purchased elsewhere and a location that would never appear. The two-part payment gave them a structure they could defend, and that structure mattered to men whose reputations were built on appearing rational. By the end of May of 1871, the group accepted Slack's framework and set the first payment in motion. The arrangement remained incomplete in the one way that mattered most. The location was still withheld. Yet the men who believed they were buying a diamond field had already committed money, secrecy, and pride. That commitment made them more vulnerable to the next step, because each new investment would feel as confirmation rather than risk. July 1871. With the first payment secured, Arnold and Slack left for England under assumed names. Philip Arnold used the name Aundel, and John Slack used his middle name, Bircham. In London, they dealt with a diamond merchant named Leopold Keller. They purchased $20,000 worth of rough diamonds and rubies, thousands of stones in all. Keller asked where they intended to have the diamonds cut. Keller did not sell them a fairy tale, he sold them tangible goods. He later testified in a London court that the two buyers, using their assumed names, purchased the rough stones and that he asked where they intended to have the diamonds cut. The question mattered because a cut stone could be traced through workshops and retailers, and because cutting required time, skilled labor, and an end customer. Arnold and Slack had no end customer. They needed raw stones that could be poured into a bag and handled as fines without creating a trail through the cutting trade. The purchase served two separate purposes, and both were central to the fraud. Some of the rough stones would be taken back to San Francisco to be shown as additional proof that the field was producing vast quantities. The rest would be held for planting at the hidden site, so that when investors eventually demanded a visit, the ground would yield what the story promised. The deception did not rely on a single lie. It relied on logistics, procurement, and planning. The same tools used by legitimate mining ventures applied to a field that existed only as a promise. In the summer of 1871, Philip Arnold and John Slack returned to San Francisco with rough diamonds and rough rubies purchased in London. Thousands of stones selected because they were uncut, portable, and easy to present as a fresh discovery. They did not carry sacks of ore or assay slips. They carried a mixed mass that could be poured out and handled, hard fragments that threw light even through grime, and colored pieces that suggested breadth, as if one hidden tract of ground had yielded many kinds of wealth instead of one. The men financing them did not want another tale by itself. They wanted a guarantee that sounded like business, not like a fever. A banker could listen to a prospector's claims and still fear that the prospector would vanish the moment the claim drew attention. The solution was collateral, something physical to hold while ownership was organized and secrecy enforced. Arnold and Slack promised to make one more trip to the secret place and return with stones valued at $2 million, then surrender those stones to the investors as security. That promise gave the investors a justification. If they could say they were holding collateral, they could invite other wealthy men into the circle without admitting uncertainty. They could treat the venture as a guarded opportunity instead of a blind gamble. In a city where fortunes were made and lost on mining rumors, that difference mattered, because men wanted to stake money without appearing reckless. Arnold and Slack left again, not to mine, but to build the only part of their story that could survive a visit to the ground. A bag of gems could convince a broker in an office. It would not survive travel into open country unless the soil itself produced gems again and again. The cousins therefore turned their effort toward salting, planting purchased stones in the earth so that any searcher who scratched at the surface would pull out glitter and assume the land itself had made it. They had planned this phase the moment they bought stones in Europe. Some of the purchase was intended for display in San Francisco, evidence meant to be handled and weighed. The rest was intended for the soil to be found later by men who had paid for the secret. A planted field cannot be created from a handful of gems. It requires volume, enough to deliver repeated finds, enough to let different men succeed in the same hour, enough to make one man's luck feel like proof for everyone watching. The stones crossed the ocean and crossed ports quietly. They sat wrapped among ordinary travel goods the way men hid cash and weapons. Rough gems do not announce themselves with smell or noise. They require no special containers. They ride unnoticed through crowded yards and docks when the men carrying them keep their hands close and their mouths shut. Back in California, their manner shifted from bluff to discipline. Arnold limited himself to controlled details because hints made listeners lean forward. Slack's silence did most of the work because silence in the West was often mistaken for reliability. They avoided tavern talk, kept their movements simple, and treated the venture as if rules already governed it, rules that punished loose speech and rewarded patience. The choice of where to plant the field was shaped by two demands pulling in opposite directions. The site had to be remote enough to stay hidden from competitors and casual travelers. It also had to be reachable by men who owned money instead of endurance. Financiers could ride horses, but they were not built for weeks of wandering, and they expected a route that could be completed without becoming a survival test. The field, therefore, needed to lie within workable distance of the Transcontinental Railroad, close enough that a party could travel out and return with supplies and mounts, without dragging a city man into a long march that broke him down. The country Arnold selected sat in the border region near Colorado and Wyoming, in high desert later described as part of the Red Desert, and close enough to the railroad that stations and telegraph lines were the nearest threads of civilization. It was open land with long sight lines and few trees. Sagebrush and greasewood clung to thin soil. Rock outcrops broke the surface in blunt shapes, baked and scoured. In daylight, the ground threw heat back upward and made the horizon shimmer. Wind crossed the flats and carried grit into eyes, into food, into bedding. A man walking there tasted dust in every breath. Summer intensified every hard feature. Waterholes were scarce and often bitter with alkali. A man could drink and still feel thirsty because the water left his mouth dry again. Sun burned the back of the neck through cloth. The ground reflected heat upward and made faces feel scorched even under wide hats. When evening came, temperature dropped fast enough to turn sweat clammy, and a man who had spent the day roasting could begin the night chilled. Reaching that country required travel that looked ordinary on paper and brutal in the body. Rail carried Arnold and Slack away from the coast on iron timetables and coal smoke. Stations came and went, wooden platforms, water tanks, small clusters of buildings that served the railroad. Men watched strangers with the practiced judgment of people who lived among drifters and thieves. Beyond the rails, movement turned into hired animals, short wagon stretches and hard walking across uneven ground where a careless step could turn an ankle and strand a man far from help. Arnold understood that travel itself could be used as evidence. A man who returned clean and rested did not look like a man who had been in harsh country. A man who returned wind-cut and dust-caked looked like a prospector who had suffered for a find. Slack reinforced that appearance because he endured discomfort without complaint and carried his rifle with the calm of long habit. A rifle near the hand also justified why a man kept his speech short in uncertain places. When they reached the region they had chosen, they searched for a rise that could be managed. A mesa offered advantages. It had clear edges. It could be approached by limited routes. From its top, a man could watch distance in every direction and spot movement long before it arrived. The surface held loose gravel and sandy soil that could be disturbed and then reshaped by wind, a useful trait when a man needed to hide where his hands had worked. The planting began with sorting by effect. The cousins treated the gems like inventory, not like treasure. Larger pieces were set aside for rare discoveries. Smaller diamonds were reserved for frequent finds. Colored stones were sorted by size and intensity, because a deep red ruby in a palm triggered more excitement than a pale one. They divided the stones into portions, then divided those portions again, so that different patches of ground could be seeded without exhausting the entire stock in one place. They planned around the way men hunt for riches when they are excited and careless. Searchers scratched near the bases of shrubs. They scrape the edges of shallow washes where rain moves loose material. They poke at cracks in rock. They stare at disturbed dirt and small mounds raised by insects, because they assume small creatures bring buried things to the surface. The cousins planted in places that matched those instincts. They avoided anything that looked like a neat line. They used clusters separated by short distances so that a searcher would find one stone, then move, then find another, and mistake that pattern for nature. The work was slow, careful, and filthy. They knelt with sweat running down their backs and dirt sticking to damp skin. They opened shallow pockets with a knife point or a stick. They pressed stones down, then covered them with loose soil, then rubbed the surface until it looked undisturbed. Where the ground held pebbles, they replaced the pebbles in the same mixed sizes so that no patch looked arranged. Where sand lay loose, they pushed stones down with a thumb and swept the top clean with the back of a hand. Every placement required attention because a single patch that looked freshly worked could trigger the wrong kind of suspicion. A salted field also needed failures. Constant success would look staged even to men eager to believe. Arnold left sections untouched so a searcher could work and find nothing, then be rewarded suddenly. That rhythm created the feeling of discovery, the surge that makes a man forget his earlier doubt. It also allowed guidance to be given without sounding like instruction. A man who has struggled accepts a suggestion with gratitude. A man who has found stones easily begins to wonder why he is being directed. Slack's role remained heavy and simple. He carried stones, he carried the rifle, and he watched the horizon. A stranger appearing in that emptiness threatened everything. If another party wandered onto the planted patch and began digging, the news could spread in an uncontrolled way and bring a rush that would expose the trick through sheer volume. If another party guessed the gems had been planted, the cousins would lose the ability to stage the guarantee. Slack watched for movement because in that open country, distance offered the only warning a man could count on. The desert did some of the hiding for them. Wind softened tracks. Insects covered the ground with constant motion. Rabbits and birds scribbled over human signs. A brief storm could beat loose soil down and erase sharp edges left by digging. In a region visited rarely, there were no witnesses to say what the surface had looked like a week earlier, and no daily traffic to preserve a clear record of disturbance. No one kept a day-by-day record of the surface. They also built secrecy into the approach. A straight route from a rail stop would create a trail that others could follow. The cousins chose turns and detours that could later be defended as necessary, either to keep their secret from rivals or to make the journey confusing to anyone outside the circle. They memorized ridges where landmarks repeated, low hills that looked alike, basins that disoriented a man who did not know the country. They noted where a party could be made to stop for water, where a camp could be placed out of view, and where a short climb would reveal enough country to check for riders. The route itself became part of the control. The physical demands never stopped. Water remained the constant calculation. Every swallow had to be weighed against distance. Horses and pack animals failed without warning when pushed too hard in heat, and an animal that went down meant time lost and danger increased. Food was basic: hard bread, salted meat, and coffee boiled dark. Every meal tasted of grit because wind carried dust into everything, and because hands that press stones into soil do not stay clean. At night, camp carried its own tension. When the air calmed, small sounds traveled far and men slept light because quiet made every rustle seem close. When the wind rose, it snapped canvas and scattered ash, and it made it harder to hear an approach. The cousins watched in turns. They kept gear tight. They avoided leaving scraps that would draw animals close because animals in the dark could startle horses and startled horses could bolt into the flats and leave men stranded. When the planting was complete, they tested it the way a builder tests a lock. Arnold scraped at chosen spots to confirm that a stone would appear quickly. Slack did the same in a different area, so the result did not depend on one pocket. They made sure the soil fell back naturally, and that the surface looked as if wind and sun had shaped it. They scattered a limited number of extra stones where a wandering searcher might scratch without direction, because the illusion had to feel larger than a single planted seam. Then they packed what remained. The display stones still mattered because a guarantee would not work unless the financiers could hold a real quantity. The cousins gathered tools, checked water, and turned back toward the rail line. Leaving a secret place tempts a man to relax. Arnold did not. A lie this large required control at every step, because a careless moment in a station or on a crowded car could invite questions that the cousins could not answer in public without revealing too much. On the return trip, they behaved like ordinary travelers. They did not speak loudly. They did not drink heavily. They did not let their packs out of reach. In cars filled with strangers, they slept in shifts. When one man closed his eyes, the other stayed awake and watched hands and movement. In crowded stops, they moved with the plain purpose of men who wanted no trouble. The stones made no sound, but danger remained constant, because the West trained men to notice weakness. As they approached California again, familiar signs appeared in stages, a shift in air, then hints of coastal influence that softened heat. Junctions and yards brought noise that the desert had not offered. Whistles, clanging couplers, shouted orders, and the steady hammer of work. That noise provided cover because in a loud place men rarely notice one more pair of worn travelers stepping down with packs in hand. Asbury Harpending met them at Lathrop, a junction east of San Francisco. The encounter was handled as a transfer, fast, quiet, and focused. Harpending took in their condition first because appearance carried weight in the rooms where the package would be opened. Arnold and Slack looked weather-marked and travel-worn, the kind of look that satisfied men who equated hardship with honesty. Slack drifted into sleep during the meeting, his body acting like it had been drained of reserve. Arnold stayed upright and alert, holding himself like a man who expected someone to try to take what he carried. Arnold brought a bulky buckskin package off the train, heavy enough to change the way he moved. It was not opened on the platform. A platform was public air and public eyes. The package was moved under control, away from casual view because its contents were intended to do a specific job indoors, overwhelm doubts and turn secrecy into deeper commitment. The planted field now existed in high desert that did not care who lied or who believed, and the next act would unfold back in San Francisco, where wealth did its work behind closed doors. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware of what was being prepared. Late summer, 1871 to October, coal smoke hung over the rail line at Lathrop, and cinders drifted down in slow spirals as the train crew shouted and moved freight. Asbury Harpending waited on the platform with his eyes fixed on the car door, not on the faces around him. Philip Arnold stepped down first with a rifle close to his body and a buckskin package slung in a way that suggested weight and awkwardness. John Slack followed as a man pulled by habit rather than energy, eyelids heavy, mouth slack, boots scuffed and dusty. They did not greet Harpending as friends. They treated him as the caretaker of the bundle. Arnold placed the buckskin package into Harpending's hands without flourish. Harpending did not open it there. He reached for a pen and wrote out a receipt on the spot, then handed it back to Arnold as proof that custody had changed. The paper was thin and ordinary, but the act mattered. It gave the San Francisco men a document they could show each other when nerves rose. It also gave Arnold and Slack a record that could be used as leverage if the investors tried to change terms later. Harpending kept the package in front of his torso as he moved away from the platform. He did not swing it as luggage. He held it as something that could be stolen with a single shove. Slack stayed close behind, keeping the same role he had played since the beginning. The silent partner whose irritation at questions gave an impression of honesty. Arnold stayed erect and watchful, gaze moving across the yard and toward any man who lingered too long. From the junction, the party moved west toward Oakland, then onto the ferry that crossed the bay. The boat was crowded with workers, clerks, and travelers who had no idea that a contest over a hidden patch of ground was unfolding inside a wrapped bundle. The ferry's engine thumped steadily beneath the boards. Wind carried salt spray and the smell of tar from the waterfront. Harpending stood where people would not brush past him, and he kept one arm tight across the package, adjusting only when a sudden sway forced him to shift his feet. The crossing did not last long, but it felt longer in the way a guarded moment stretches time. Harpending watched hands more than faces. A thief did not need to know what the bundle held. A thief needed only to see a man protect something too carefully. Arnold and Slack said little. When they did speak, it was in short phrases meant to signal that they were tired and wanted to be done with travel, not men eager to talk. On the San Francisco side, a carriage was waiting. Harpending climbed in first and set the package between his boots rather than on the seat where it could slide. The driver started at once, wheels rattling over uneven streets. The city was moving into evening. Shops were closing. Men crowded into restaurants and saloons. Gaslight flickered behind glass, and the darker stretches between lamps made every doorway and alley look deeper than it was. Harpending did not relax until the carriage turned into a quieter block and stopped at his door. Inside, the room had been prepared for a private showing. Curtains were drawn, lamps were positioned, so light fell onto a central space and not onto windows. Chairs had been pushed back to create standing room, and the air already carried cigar smoke from men who had been waiting too long without drinking. William Chapman Ralston was there, controlled and unsmiling, posture steady as if he had decided he would not be rattled. William Lent stood with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the buckskin package. General George S. Dodge sat straight and still, shoulders set, gaze shifting only when someone moved too close to the table. Harpending put the buckskin package down in the center of the billiard table. The choice of that surface was deliberate. It offered space to spread out whatever was inside, and it put every man close enough to see without kneeling or fumbling. A white sheet was laid across the felt to make small objects visible and to prevent any claim that stones had been hidden in fabric. Harpending took a knife and cut through ties and folds slowly, keeping his hands in view. He did not allow anyone to reach in early. When the last fastening gave, he tipped the buckskin and emptied it. The contents hit the sheet with a harsh sound, many small impacts close together, then a scattering roll as pieces spread outward and stopped against wrinkles in the cloth. The pile was not neat. It was a mass of rough stones, some pale and hard-edged, some darker and dull, some colored red, green, and blue. The light from the lamps caught on certain faces and flashed sharply. Other pieces absorbed light and stayed matte. There was no polish, no careful sorting, and no presentation meant to flatter a buyer. No one praised it. No one joked. For several seconds, the room was silent except for breathing and the small scrape of a chair leg as a man stepped closer. Then hands moved in. The first touches were cautious, fingertips lifting pieces and setting them back down as if the stones might somehow reveal themselves as imitation. A lens appeared. Someone used a pin and a small knife point to test hardness on edges. Pieces were held to lamplight and turned, faces checked, corners examined. These were men who had spent years judging ore samples and paper promises, and they treated the pile as both treasure and evidence. Harpending repeated the story Arnold and Slack had delivered during the trip in. The cousins claimed they had divided the promised haul into 2 packs. They claimed they had crossed a river on a raft they built, and 1 pack had been lost to the current. The tale was meant to explain absence without raising suspicion. It also inflated the value of what remained by suggesting it was only half of what had been recovered. The investors did not demand a map of the river. They did not ask for witnesses. The purpose of the story was not proof. It was cover for the missing portion. The display achieved a simple result. The San Francisco group felt they held collateral. They had already paid Slack $50,000 for his share, with a second payment tied to this third trip. Now, with a fresh bag placed in their custody, they could tell themselves they were not merely listening to promises, they were holding security. That belief loosened their next decisions because men who believe they are protected take larger risks. Behind the calm talk, the investors were already trying to solve their biggest obstacle. Arnold and Slack still owned the story. The San Francisco men wanted the cousins out of the center as soon as possible. They wanted a company controlled by bankers and promoters, not by 2 prospectors who could vanish, refuse access, or renegotiate in the middle of a crisis. After the first round of handling stones, the conversation shifted to purchase terms. Men tested language that would buy the cousins' interest, control their silence, and reduce them to paid participants. Arnold listened with his rifle within reach and answered in short, stubborn lines. He refused to be treated as a servant carrying a sack. He insisted that the location would remain with him until money and protections were settled, and until he believed the investors could keep the secret. When questions pushed for landmarks or a direct route, he shut them down. He warned that rivals would ride after any hint and that the country was hard enough to kill careless men even without gunfire. Slack sat apart with a closed face. When his name was used in a proposal, he did not argue details, but he did not accept being dismissed as if he were already paid and irrelevant. The investors tried to tie the cousins to immediate obligations. A pile of stones on a table could not secure land, file claims, or keep opportunists from following rumors. The syndicate wanted the next visit scheduled and controlled, and they wanted it done under their supervision so they could start treating the field as property. Arnold pushed responsibility back onto them. He demanded that the syndicate arrange legal structure and financing while he handled the ground and guarded the location. The stance kept him central and forced the businessmen to move eastward into corporate planning if they wanted progress. Still, the men in the room were not satisfied with the stone's reality alone. They needed value placed on paper by someone whose name carried weight beyond the Pacific coast. Without that, they could not pull in New York capital or persuade prominent Eastern figures to join. The West was full of mines and schemes, and Eastern money treated Western claims as suspect until a known authority endorsed them. The San Francisco men therefore agreed on 2 steps that would give their gamble a documented valuation and a planned inspection. First, they would take a sample east to Charles Louis Tiffany in New York City for appraisal. Tiffany's name was recognized in the highest circles, and a statement from him could turn the stones into an asset. Second, they would hire a mining engineer to inspect the field itself. A pile on a table could be assembled in a city. A deposit that produced stones under an engineer's eye would be a different kind of proof, and it would allow the investors to claim they had been prudent, not reckless. They also understood the danger of bringing outsiders in too early. An appraiser might ask questions that led to leakage. An engineer might demand to see the route and the location in a way that reduced the cousins' control. The group tried to manage that risk by keeping the sample limited. They chose 10% of the new bag, a portion large enough to represent the whole yet small enough that losing it would not destroy their position. The selection was done in the same room with multiple eyes watching. Because trust inside the syndicate was still new and still fragile. For all their careful talk, greed pushed them toward publicity in a smaller way. They allowed a generous portion of the stones to go on display in the window of San Francisco jeweler William Willis. The move served several purposes at once. It fed the city's demand for the next strike, which could make future stock offerings easier. It tested how public talk might rise around the idea of an American diamond field. It also let the investors watch which men showed sudden interest, because sudden interest meant a leak might already be spreading. The window display drew a steady stream. Men stopped in work clothes and stared through glass, faces close, breath fogging the pane. Well-dressed clerks paused on their way home and pointed with gloved fingers. A sailor in cheap boots stood long enough to memorize the look of the rough stones, then repeated the story in a waterfront bar as if he had been part of the secret. By night, saloons carried a new strain of talk. Diamonds in the West, diamonds in the interior, stones that could be found without blasting and without stamp mills, wealth that could fit in a pocket. That talk had consequences. Rumor pulled in opportunists who did not respect property or law. Men who had ruined themselves chasing gold began watching for any hint of a route inland. Competing promoters started asking questions that sounded casual but were built to extract a detail: one station name, one river, one mountain outline. Newspapermen sniffed for a story that could sell papers in a city addicted to sudden fortune. The syndicate, hearing these ripples, tightened its behavior. Meetings became fewer and more controlled. Men were instructed to speak in general terms if questioned and to deny knowledge of any specific location. Clerks were kept away from papers that mentioned names or sums. Messengers were not trusted with sensitive notes. The investors also watched Arnold more carefully because he had become both their key and their greatest risk. He was the man who could lead them to the field, and he was the man who could lead someone else there if he felt cornered. Arnold handled that pressure by acting offended when doubts were voiced. He let irritation show in his jaw and his posture. He responded to suspicion as if it were disrespect rather than caution. The performance worked because it gave the investors something to apologize for. Once a man apologizes, he tends to stop pressing. Arnold also kept emphasizing the danger of competitors and thieves, not as a vague warning, but as a practical threat in a country where men had been killed for less than a sack of gems. This framing made secrecy feel necessary for survival, not a game of concealment. Slack remained useful by withdrawing. He appeared when necessary, then drifted away and slept. He avoided long talk, which prevented him from contradicting Arnold. He also made it easier for the investors to treat Arnold as the necessary partner, and Slack as a paid subordinate, which fit their desire to push the cousins aside once the ground was secured. Slack's slow, weary manner gave no hint of panic. It suggested that he believed the story because he had lived it. The Eastern trip required planning that looked mundane but carried danger. Travel from San Francisco to New York City on the railroad meant days of cramped cars, bad sleep, and constant stops. Coal smoke seeped in through cracks. Cinders found their way into hair and collars. Water tasted metallic from station tanks. Food was rushed at depots: hot coffee, bread, stewed meat, all eaten quickly because the whistle would pull the train away without mercy. A man could not guard a jewel sample by taking his eyes off it, even for a minute. The men who would carry the sample prepared it as they would prepare a bank transfer. The stones were wrapped, then wrapped again, placed into a smaller container, then sealed and kept under personal control. They avoided letting porters handle it. They avoided leaving it in a hotel room. They treated every stranger who offered help as a potential problem. This level of caution was not paranoia. It was an admission that if the sample vanished, the syndicate would lose the very tool it needed to impress Tiffany. The legal side advanced in parallel. The investors knew that if the appraisal came back favorable, they would need Eastern corporate machinery fast. They selected Samuel Latham Mitchell Barlow, a New York attorney whose corporate reputation could handle large investments and complicated ownership. Barlow's involvement would make it easier to draw prominent Eastern men into the venture without making it resemble a reckless Western venture. It would also help create paperwork that could survive hostile scrutiny if the story ever turned sour. By October of 1871, the San Francisco group had moved from excitement to organization. They had physical stones treated as collateral. They had a plan to seek a Tiffany appraisal using a guarded sample. They had agreed to bring in a mining engineer for field verification. They had a path into New York legal structure through Barlow. The billiard table display remained the moment that changed them, because it shifted the venture from talk to tangible objects and from curiosity to coordinated action. In November 1871, a small packet of rough stones left San Francisco under constant hand control, wrapped and rewrapped so it would pass as ordinary travel clutter. The men carrying it treated every stop as a threat. They slept in fragments on hard benches, woke to whistles and shouted station calls, and kept the packet pinned to their ribs through crowds that smelled of wet wool, coal smoke, and fried grease. They did not speak the word diamonds where strangers could hear. If anyone asked what the parcel contained, they called it a mineral sample for a private appraisal and gave no other detail. The ride east punished bodies in ways that office men rarely admitted. Cars rocked hard and the steel wheels hammered joints until teeth clenched on their own. Coal grit drifted in through imperfect windows and settled into eyes, hair, and cuffs. The toilet stank and the water tasted of metal from station tanks. Sleeping meant folding into an angle that left legs numb and necks stiff. At night, weak lamps lit rows of passengers who stared forward without expression. Men with tired faces, women holding children close, veterans with old injuries, drifters with everything they owned tied into bundles at their feet. Meals came in rushed bursts at depots. A man stepped down, stretched his back, and walked fast to whatever counter served hot coffee. Grease soaked through bread, meat was overcooked and still tasted of fat. Conversations rose and fell with the train schedule, then stopped when the whistle called everyone back. The men guarding the packet ate with one hand and kept the other near their coat, because a thief needed only a shoulder bump in a crowd to start trouble. As the cars rolled east, the landscape changed, and each change brought more platforms, more towns, and more strangers watching. On the plains, wind slammed dust against the cars and made the horizon look empty and endless. Farther east, frost held to shaded ground and turned puddles into hard skin. Rivers widened and ran dark beneath drifting ice. Towns grew denser, with more brick, more chimneys, and more men standing idle near platforms watching passengers step down. Telegraph wires ran alongside the rails for long stretches, and every station office meant another place where a careless word could be overheard, repeated, and sent onward to someone hungry for a scoop. When the party stepped into New York City, the air carried a different weight. The smell was coal smoke mixed with horse manure, damp stone, and harbor salt, layered with the sharp odor of crowded streets where too many bodies moved too close together. Wheels clattered on cobbles. Drivers cursed. Street sellers called out prices. People pushed forward with shoulders squared, moving as if delay could cost them rent. San Francisco had ambition and noise. New York carried older power built into banks, law offices, and social networks that could shut a man out with a quiet refusal. The destination was not a mining office or a broker's room. It was a business whose name carried respectability and influence. Tiffany and Company operated in a world where reputation determined who was trusted, and where a careless appraisal could disgrace a firm in the same rooms that granted it access. The syndicate needed that name on paper. A favorable judgment would not create a diamond field, but it would create a document that other wealthy men would take seriously when deciding whether to listen. The men entered with stiff caution. Inside, the atmosphere changed at once. Floors were clean enough to reflect light. Glass cases displayed finished jewelry that made rough stones look crude by comparison. Clerks moved with practiced calm, voices controlled, hands steady, clothing neat. The setting forced the visitors to change their manner. A prospector's blunt talk that worked in a coastal brokerage room would be treated as a trick here. They spoke in measured tones and kept the parcel closed until they were in private, because public spectacle would invite gossip. The parcel was taken into a back room and opened on cloth under steady light. The men at Tiffany did not rush to praise or to flatter. They approached as technicians. Scales were set on a stable surface. Lenses were laid out. Small tools and trays were set out. The stones were poured out and then reduced to order. Diamonds were separated from colored stones. Colored stones were separated again by visible type and quality. The act removed excitement from the scene and replaced it with sorting, weighing, and careful notes. The examiners tested hardness where it could be tested safely. They examined crystal faces and internal character through magnification. They checked colored stones for traits that distinguished them from common substitutes. Many pieces were small and flawed, suited for industrial use or lower-grade setting rather than high jewelry. But they were genuine stones. That fact mattered more than beauty. A fraud collapses when the sample turns out to be glass. The syndicate's scheme survived the first professional inspection because the material in the parcel was real, even while the origin remained hidden. A written valuation followed, the kind of document that could be carried into a boardroom and read aloud without embarrassment. The paper did not name a location. It did not certify a deposit. It confirmed that the parcel consisted of genuine diamonds and other gems and that, as a lot, it held substantial market value. For the syndicate, that sheet changed the tone of every later conversation. It gave them something formal to present when cautious men demanded a reason to treat the venture as more than a rumor dressed up in Western talk. With the Tiffany paper in hand, the problem shifted from proof to structure. Eastern capital demanded Eastern oversight. Men in New York did not want to send money across the continent to a group of Californians they barely knew, tied to a site that no map could show. The syndicate therefore sought an Eastern legal anchor and placed the matter into the hands of Samuel Latham Mitchell Barlow, a corporate attorney whose name carried weight in the city's professional world. Barlow was not a miner and not a jeweler. His work was to take what the group claimed it possessed and make it look defensible on paper, with contracts, subscriptions, and clear lines of authority. Barlow's first questions were hard and practical. He wanted to know who owned what. He asked who claimed discovery, who claimed purchase, and what promises had been made to the two discoverers who still controlled the location. He demanded to see agreements and to understand payment schedules, because a contract that left Philip Arnold and John Slack free to renegotiate later could destroy the enterprise at the worst possible moment. The syndicate could not disclose the location, but it could disclose the deal structure, the obligations already accepted, and the penalties it intended to enforce if the discoverers tried to turn secrecy into leverage. Barlow tightened language where it was weak. He drafted provisions aimed at confidentiality and at consequences if the discoverers tried to sell the secret elsewhere. He treated the location itself as property that had to be protected before it could be exploited. The syndicate accepted this discipline because it understood its greatest danger. The danger was not only that the field might be false, the danger was that Arnold and Slack might lead a different group to the site first, leaving the syndicate holding stones it could not connect to any ground it could claim. The Tiffany valuation tempted expansion. With a respected name now attached to the parcel, the syndicate began courting additional investors whose own names would add force if the venture reached the public. These conversations were held quietly and framed as offers of inclusion, not as a public stock sale. The men approached were told they would not be asked to gamble in a newspaper spectacle. They would be asked to secure a discovery before anyone else could reach it. That framing made secrecy sound disciplined rather than suspicious, and it made participation feel exclusive rather than reckless. Money came in through private subscription. Each commitment increased pressure to proceed, because each new investor brought his own pride into the circle. A cautious outsider could dismiss the story as nonsense and move on. A man inside the circle had a personal need to believe, because belief protected his judgment and his standing. Inside the syndicate, skepticism became socially expensive. Men who raised objections risked being treated as timid and excluded from what others insisted was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. That pressure pushed men toward action even when their private doubts tried to surface. The syndicate also recognized that jewelry valuation and legal paperwork could not substitute for field inspection. A parcel of stones could be assembled in any city if a man had cash and access. The only way to turn the story into an enterprise was to make the ground itself produce stones in front of a competent witness. The investors selected a mining engineer whose professional reputation could withstand later scrutiny. They needed a man who could examine soil and rock, describe what he saw in technical language, and write a report that sounded clinical rather than excited. They also needed someone who could travel and keep quiet, because talk would turn a secret venture into a rush. The hiring required a bargain over secrecy that strained professional dignity. The engineer would be asked to travel without being told the route in advance. He would be asked to accept being led in a way that prevented him from later guiding rivals to the site. The syndicate justified these restrictions with the harsh logic of Western rushes. If a diamond field became public, large numbers of men would arrive, and large numbers of men would bring claim-jumping, violence, and chaos. The engineer, trained to treat deposits as physical facts, was forced to accept that his inspection would take place inside a plan designed to control what he learned. By early 1872, the syndicate had formed into two linked centers: San Francisco Capital and New York Respectability. Messages traveled between them by telegraph and mail, shaped into careful language and carried by trusted hands when possible. Members watched newspapers for hints that the story had leaked. They watched rival mining circles for unusual movement. They watched each other for signs of second thoughts. They also watched Arnold and Slack for the simplest risks: heavy drinking, loud talk, and sudden disappearances that could mean the secret was being sold to someone else. Arnold and Slack were kept close with a mix of comfort and surveillance. They were given enough money to avoid desperation because desperation produces mistakes. But they were watched because comfort does not stop a man from chasing a better offer. When the discoverers entered a room, eyes tracked them. When they left, someone noticed which direction they went. They were invited into meetings only when necessary, and the tone of those meetings made clear they were not equals. They held essential information, but the men with money and lawyers controlled the rooms, the schedules, and the terms. The story also widened in a way the syndicate could not fully control. The idea of an American diamond field began circulating through social circles that included people with no loyalty to the syndicate and no need to keep silence. Such a rumor attracts gamblers and promoters, but it also attracts men whose careers are built on testing claims. In the federal world, scientific surveys were expanding their reach, mapping the West and judging mineral stories that could drive settlement and conflict. A diamond field in the interior was not just a private opportunity. It was a claim that could pull attention from scientists and officials who did not care about investors' pride. The syndicate tried to stay ahead of that attention by moving quickly toward a controlled inspection staged on its terms. The logic was blunt. If the engineer could be brought to the site and made to find stones with his own hands, the syndicate could claim verification. Once a verification report existed, the men behind the venture could move into full incorporation and capitalization before skeptical outsiders could interfere. The timetable became tight because every month that passed increased the chance that someone outside the circle would force the question in public, and public questions were harder to manage than private doubts. Planning the inspection required more than travel arrangements. It required controlling the way other men learned. The syndicate selected a meeting point reachable by rail, so invited observers could arrive without traveling from San Francisco with the discoverers. The point lay in Wyoming territory on the transcontinental line. There, men could step down from cars, hire horses, and pack animals, and purchase supplies without creating a single obvious trail back to the syndicate's offices. The discoverers would then guide the party into open country under conditions designed to keep the location from being remembered in useful detail. The syndicate argued over who would be allowed to join. Each additional man increased risk. Each additional man also spread responsibility. If a respected engineer returned with a report and stones taken from the ground, the story would carry force that no private showing could match. The syndicate chose men whose reputations mattered and whose discretion could be relied upon until the venture was secured. Decisions were made with quiet calculation: who could keep his mouth shut, who could ride without complaining, who could be trusted not to wander off and take his own bearings. The secrecy measures were severe enough to create their own danger. Restricting an engineer's knowledge of the route could generate resentment. It could also create an excuse for the discoverers to shape what the engineer saw. The syndicate accepted that danger because it believed the discoverers had already proven themselves by delivering real stones, and because the men in charge preferred the risk of manipulation to the risk of competitors learning the path. They told themselves that once the ground was secured and the legal structure completed, secrecy could relax. But until then, secrecy would be treated as necessary. As spring advanced, preparations became detailed and ordinary in appearance. Saddles, pack animals, tents, provisions, tools, and sample containers were listed and purchased under plain labels so suppliers would not ask questions. The engineer's instruments were considered lens, small scales, sample bags, and field tools used to examine soil and rock. The syndicate discussed how to handle the first hour at the site. If the engineer found stones immediately, suspicion could rise. If he found nothing at first, irritation could build and turn into sharp questions. The discoverers would need to deliver results at the right pace to keep confidence steady. Money was now at risk in a new way. Once the inspection began, the story would either solidify or collapse. If it collapsed, the Tiffany valuation would become a document of embarrassment rather than prudence, and the men involved would face questions from partners, creditors, and rivals. They would face public mockery if the tale escaped into print, because a national diamond scandal would draw attention that a failed mine never could. The syndicate's leaders understood that their names, their bank ties, and their social standing were now attached to what they were doing, and that attachment could damage them even if they tried to claim later that they had been cautious. The syndicate approached the departure date with nervous discipline. Meetings became shorter and sharper. The discoverers were pushed to commit to times and arrangements. The engineer received instructions on where to arrive and what to bring, with confidentiality demanded again and again. Letters were sealed and carried by hand rather than trusted to casual messengers who might gossip for amusement. Men who normally enjoyed attention learned to avoid it because attention was now a threat. June 3, 1872 arrived with the plan fixed. The engineer was in motion. The selected investors were committed to travel. The discoverers were ready to guide, confuse, and deliver success on schedule. On paper and in private rooms, the venture was arranged on paper as an organized operation rather than a rumor, and the paperwork let men sleep without admitting they were afraid. That evening, final communications were brief and coded. A telegram could not carry a confession, but it could carry an order: arrive, meet, bring canvas, bring rope, bring extra saddlebags, bring sample tins. In San Francisco, travel funds were placed into sealed envelopes made to resemble routine disbursements. In New York, Barlow's office locked drafts and subscription papers into a cabinet and sent only the necessary documents west, because a single misplaced page could reveal names tied to the venture. In hotels and boarding rooms along the rail line, men checked their gear twice, then checked it again, because a forgotten tool could turn into a delay, and a delay could turn into questions. By the time darkness settled over the city streets, the men who believed they were securing a diamond field had done everything they could from city offices. The next step belonged to the road and to the discoverers. In the first days of June 1872, the inspection party came into Rawlins on the Union Pacific and stepped down into a town that existed to feed a railroad, entertain men with pay in their pockets, and bury the ones who stayed drunk and careless. Rawlins was a stop built of boards and urgency, with coal smoke hanging in layers above the yard, wind pushing grit through every crack, and horses tied everywhere there was a post. The main street carried wagon ruts and a film of dust that turned slick where spilled liquor hit it. Saloons did not hide what they were. Their doors stayed open, their windows glowed in daylight, and the noise inside rolled into the street in waves of laughter, curses, and slammed fists. Men in worn coats drifted from one doorway to another, watching strangers for weakness. The air tasted of smoke, sweat, and old beer. Everything in Rawlins felt temporary except the hunger for money. Henry Janin arrived as the hired expert and carried himself like a man used to being listened to. His kit was compact and disciplined. Lenses, paper, sample bags, a small scale, and tools for examining stone and soil in the open. He was there because the financiers wanted a professional verdict that could be read in San Francisco and in New York without forcing anyone to rely on camp talk. He had no interest in joining a circus. He wanted a site, a deposit, and a set of observations he could put into clear language, then sign his name to without shame. General George S. Dodge was present as a man with stature and caution, and as a man who had learned that reputations are lost faster than they are built. Asbury Harpending moved differently, restless, quick, always alert to the difference between a secret and a headline. Alfred Rubery, Harpending's English friend, had the eyes of someone who expected to see an American wonder and planned to tell the story later in rooms where curiosity and money lived close together. Philip Arnold and John Slack stayed quiet and controlled, watching every glance, measuring each man's impatience, and holding the only thing that truly mattered, the path to the place they claimed would make all of them rich. The day in Rawlins began with procurement and tension instead of speeches. Horses were chosen for hard miles. Pack animals were fitted with loads that had to be balanced and secured, water tins, coffee, food that would not spoil, canvas, rope, picks, shovels, and containers for taking samples back to town. Weapons were checked without ceremony. Men in this territory carried firearms because robbery was common and because dispute could become violence before a marshal could even hear of it. The investors were not naive. They knew a rumor of gems could get a man followed, and they knew a party moving out of Rawlins with new saddles and extra pack animals looked like a target. Arnold laid down terms before leaving. No riding off alone. No stopping to hunt. No wandering to take bearings. No man would push ahead to scout. No man would lag behind. Slack would enforce the rules, and the enforcement would not be polite. The group accepted those terms because they had already paid for the privilege of standing close to the secret, and because the land beyond Rawlins was too empty to gamble with a quarrel. They rode out from town and left the yard noise behind, the clank of coupling cars, the hiss of steam, the shout of a foreman. The country opened fast into flats and ridges with little shade and fewer landmarks that held a name. The ground carried alkali in places and broke into hard fragments that cut hooves. Wind ran steady and kept dust in motion. The sun pressed down without mercy. Sweat dried into salt streaks on clothing. Every swallow of water was measured because there was no guarantee of a clean source ahead. A man could ride into a shallow draw expecting a stream and find only cracked mud and a smell of stale dampness. Arnold set an uneven pace that made the route difficult to hold in the mind. He pushed hard for stretches, then slowed without warning, then stopped to study a distant line of hills as if he had lost his way. When he stopped, he and Slack rode to a higher point, scanned the horizon, and returned with a correction that made them look both fallible and essential. The performance served two purposes. It confused anyone trying to build a mental map, and it forced everyone else to surrender control. A man who believes he cannot navigate without the guide stops trying to hold the route in his memory. Janin watched the landscape the way a trained engineer watches it, not for beauty but for what it said. He noticed the kinds of rock exposed on slopes, the texture of soil, the way water had cut channels, and what could grow where. He kept these observations to himself because Arnold did not invite questions, and because the party did not have the freedom of a normal field inspection. This was not his expedition. He was a passenger in a plan designed by two men who carried rifles and owned the only knowledge that mattered. The first night's camp was a practical stop in a slight break in the terrain. Saddles came off. Horses were rubbed down and hobbled. Coffee was boiled thick, and the taste hit the tongue like burned earth. Food was simple and eaten quickly. The wind did not stop when darkness came, and it snapped canvas and carried the smell of horse sweat and damp leather. Men slept in short intervals because the ground was hard and because the mind does not rest easily when a fortune is supposed to be waiting ahead, and the only men who can lead to it might be liars. On the second day, the route cut through rougher ground and forced detours. The party crossed dry channels that dropped suddenly and climbed out again. Pack animals stumbled when a rock rolled under a hoof. Riders tightened their legs and shifted weight to keep an animal upright. Water was rationed again and again, and the men spoke less because dry mouths made conversation painful. When one rider cursed, the sound carried far in the open air and then vanished as if the land itself refused to hold it. Slack maintained order without argument. When Rubry tried to ride up beside Arnold to ask where they were headed, Slack angled his horse across the line and blocked him. When Harpending wandered to the side to look at a ridge, Slack called him back with a short command that carried no friendliness. When Janin paused at an outcrop and reached toward the ground, Arnold ordered him to remount and move. Janin did not protest again. He kept his tools packed and his temper controlled. By the third day, fatigue showed in small ways. Chafing from saddle time made men shift constantly. Hands cramped from reins, lips split and bled. Eyes burned from dust. Urine darkened from dehydration, and nobody joked. A rider who fell could break bone and end the expedition, so every man became careful with his own body and his animal. Janin protected his notes and sample bags from sweat and grit because he understood that his report would be attacked later if the venture collapsed, and a sloppy record would make him the easiest man to blame. The promised blindfold was introduced as a non-negotiable rule as the fourth day approached. Arnold announced it plainly, saying the final approach would be made with cloth tied over eyes so no one could remember the last turns. Janine objected once, stating that professional work demanded a clear route and a clear location. Dodge answered without raising his voice, explaining that secrecy was the entire value of the undertaking until claims and legal structures were secured. Harpending backed him with a short, impatient remark that made it clear the decision was already made. Arnold listened without emotion. Slack's hand stayed near his weapon, not as a threat in the open, but as a reminder that rules in this country were enforced by men, not by paper. Cloth strips were tied tight. The blindfolds cut off the horizon and turned the ride into a sequence of sounds and jolts. Wind sounded louder without sight. Hoofbeats struck harder. The smell of animals and sun-baked soil felt stronger. Men rode close together in a line, one hand on the saddle horn, the other on the reins, trusting the horse and the rider ahead. Sweat ran down faces under the cloth, mixed with dust, and rubbed skin raw where the fabric shifted. A sudden stop threatened collisions and tangles, and every rider understood that a panicked horse could throw a blind man into rock and end him. Slack enforced compliance the moment anyone tried to loosen a knot. One rider reached up to adjust his cloth. Slack barked a command and the hand dropped at once. The message was clear. The blindfold was not a symbol. It was an order, and disobedience would be treated as theft. When Arnold finally called a halt and told the men to remove the cloth, the light hit, their eyes like punishment. They blinked, squinted, and tried to seize the scene and lock it into memory. The land was high and open. A broad mesa spread underfoot with sandy soil, loose gravel, and scattered stone. The wind crossed it cleanly with no tree line to slow it. To the south stood a solitary cone-shaped mountain that dominated everything nearby. The landmark looked like a pointer placed in the landscape for anyone who might come searching later. The ground itself looked ordinary, which created a split second of disappointment that Arnold did not give them time to hold. Arnold dismounted first and walked forward with a calm that suggested ownership. Slack stayed near the group and watched hands. Harpending and Dodge stepped off their mounts with controlled urgency, boots crunching on rock. Rubery moved fast, driven by the need to see the miracle and touch it. Janin kept his movements measured, forcing his breathing to settle so he could observe rather than join the scramble. Within minutes, the demonstration began. Rubery scraped at the surface and lifted a stone that caught sun. He raised it and shouted, and the sound pulled every head toward him at once. The stone was not cut or polished, but it had the hardness and the look the men had been promised. That single shout tore open restraint. Men dropped to their knees. Fingers dug into dry soil, pinched and sifted, and spread dirt across palms to check for a flash of crystal. Finds followed quickly, then continued. A man would scrape a shallow depression and feel a hard edge, then hold it up and grin with a face that looked suddenly younger. Another would uncover a colored stone and call out, and two others would crowd close to see it for themselves. Stones came up pale and sharp-edged, and stones came up red, green, and blue. Each find pushed the group further from caution and deeper into certainty. The surface yielded enough success that the mind stopped asking for deeper proof and began asking only how fast ownership could be secured. Janin moved through the excitement with his work intact. He watched where stones came up and how close they sat to the surface. He observed that a disturbance of soil produced a reward with unnatural speed. He took samples methodically, placing soil and stones into separate bags, labeling them and keeping them in order so he could later describe what he had taken. He studied the rock and the ground cover and made notes in a hand that stayed steady even while men nearby shouted. His discipline gave the syndicate the one thing it had needed from him: a professional presence in the middle of a scene that otherwise looked like men grabbing at treasure. Arnold guided outcomes without making it obvious. When a man searched too long without success, Arnold pointed to a new patch with a small motion that could be read as casual advice. The man would dig there and find a stone, then look back with relief and gratitude. Slack kept the group within the seated stretches by standing in the right places and using his body and his rifle to discourage wandering. He did not lecture. He prevented. He controlled movement so the illusion never had to defend itself in open argument. The search continued for more than an hour. Stones were found again and again in the same way, shallow and sudden. The consistency built a particular kind of belief. Men stopped thinking in terms of chance and began thinking in terms of planning, claims, security, and the size of the company they would form. Harpending watched Janin closely, waiting for the engineer to speak. Dodge watched Harpending, knowing that words spoken on the mesa would become decisions in boardrooms. Janin began speaking in the language the investors had paid for. He described richness. He stated that the deposit was genuine in the sense that it produced what was being sought. He discussed how a field like this could be developed with proper organization and capital. His tone carried professional authority. Each sentence tightened the syndicate's grip on its own optimism. Rubery listened with satisfaction. Harpending's face reflected the relief of a man whose gamble had just found support. Dodge's posture shifted from guarded to decisive, because men like him moved forward once they believed. Once the initial excitement was secured, Janin turned toward legal protection. He treated the mesa as property that needed to be wrapped in claims quickly, before any rumor drove outsiders toward it. Measurements were taken in rough field fashion. Boundaries were sketched and marked. Notes were recorded so they could be transferred into formal filings later. The land claimed was enormous, 3,000 acres, a sweep intended to cover more ground than any single operation could work at once. The scale served two roles. It widened legal control and it made the venture feel too large to doubt. The party did not dig deep trenches that would have tested the ground below the surface. They did not sink shafts. They did not blast rock. The inspection was structured as a demonstration under the discoverer's terms, and the discoverers had delivered a surface that produced gems in a way that satisfied men trained to accept quick evidence when the evidence glittered in their hands. The most rigorous tests were postponed in favor of immediate control, because the investors feared competitors more than they feared error. When the day's light began to shift and the wind grew colder, Arnold ordered the party back to their mounts. The blindfolds were used again for the departure. This time the cloth did not produce protest. The successful search had transformed obedience into acceptance. Men tied the strips over their own eyes and kept their hands down. The secret had become valuable enough that even the ones being manipulated defended the method, because the method was now part of what made the prize feel like it belonged to them. The ride back to Rawlins was slower. Muscles were tired and horses were worked. When the blindfolds came off near camp, men checked the horizon with a new habit, looking for riders that were not there and imagining rivals that had not yet heard the story. Camp that night carried a different mood. Men spoke in low tones of what they had found and what it would mean. They counted stones and compared pieces not as curiosities but as proof of a fortune that could be measured. Janin kept his samples separate and orderly. Dodge stayed sober and watchful. Harpending fought the urge to shout the news into the night. In Rawlins, the return to a railroad town felt abrupt. The yard noise struck the ear again, whistles, shouts, iron clanging, horses stamping. Saloons overflowed with men who had nothing to do with diamonds and nothing to lose by listening. The inspection party moved through that scene with guarded urgency. Harpending wanted to celebrate and could not. Dodge wanted to send messages and had to be careful. Rubery looked at strangers as if each one might be the man who would follow them. Arnold and Slack behaved like men who had done exactly what they set out to do and were now waiting to be paid in full for it. Janine sat under lamplight that night and began to convert the trip into a report. He had been hired for a fee of $2,500, and the syndicate had also offered him a chance to purchase company stock at $10 per share. 1,000 shares reserved for him as part of the arrangement. The offer was not hidden. It was understood as incentive and as a way to bind him to the venture's success. He wrote while the experience was fresh, pages filled with observations and conclusions that would travel farther than any saddle trail. The words he chose mattered more than the stones in his pocket. A handful of gems could impress a room for an hour. A signed report could move thousands of dollars in a day. He described what the party had done, what he had seen, and what he believed the ground contained. He wrote with confidence built from repeated surface finds under his own hands. The paper did not include every doubt that should have been raised by a mixed assortment of gems. It carried the certainty the investors needed, and certainty was the fuel that would carry the venture into full public life. When the party boarded the Union Pacific again and the train began pulling away, Rawlins shrank into a strip of buildings and smoke behind them. Inside the cars, voices stayed low, but the talk turned relentlessly toward ownership, filings, incorporation, and how quickly money could be gathered before anyone else tried to seize the ground. Dodge considered what his name would mean when attached to the venture. Harpending considered how far the story could spread and how much it could raise. Rubery thought in terms of influence and prestige. Janin thought in terms of claims and the formal language he would use when asked to defend his conclusions. Arnold and Slack watched all of them and understood that the moment of greatest power for the Khan had arrived. The moment when other men needed to believe so badly that belief would replace scrutiny. June to August 1872. Henry Janin returned to San Francisco, tired, dirty, and certain. He carried field notes and a practiced confidence that had guided expensive decisions for years. His contract was simple. He had been paid a fixed cash fee plus travel expenses, and he had been offered a right to take a block of company shares at a low price. He was being used as an expert in public, and he was being tied to the venture in private. The men who waited for his conclusion understood that arrangement, and they wanted it, because an expert who shared in the upside could be counted on to defend his own judgment. William C. Ralston received Janin inside the Bank of California, where the air felt cooler than the sun-struck street outside and the city's noise was reduced to a muffled hum. The building was run on ink and routine. Clerks moved between counters with pens tucked behind their ears. Ledgers lay open on desks, thick and heavy, filled with numbers and names. Ralston sat upright, hands still, eyes quick. He had backed mines, mills, and railroad deals. He knew what a rumor could do, and he knew what Janin's name could do when it was stamped onto a report. George D. Roberts arrived early and took a chair as if it already belonged to him. Asbury Harpending came in fast, talking before the door fully shut. William Lent and General George S. Dodge followed, formal and guarded. David Colton entered last, quiet, with a habit of watching faces before he spoke. On the table, packets of rough stones sat in small envelopes and cloth tied and labeled. They were handled as evidence, not as jewelry. The discussion started with control. If the ground could be secured, the stones would become a supply that could be managed instead of a lucky find that would be scattered to thieves. They talked in practical terms. Cutting shops could be established in California. Skilled cutters could be hired or imported. Graders could be trained. Secure rooms could be built. A vault could be stocked and guarded. Sales could be organized under their own rules instead of through European centers that set prices and kept the best business for themselves. Secrecy was described as security. Everyone in the room had seen what happened when a rich strike became public before it was controlled. Notices on claim posts were torn down at night. Men replaced them with their own writing in the same spot and dared anyone to challenge them. In camp, a dispute could begin with shouting and end with a pistol fired into a chest at close range. After the body hit the dirt, the living argued over paperwork and witnesses as if paperwork could undo a killing. The land itself created another danger. The supposed field lay on federal public land. Ownership required more than confidence and money. It required a legal path to title. The mining law signed earlier that year declared that valuable mineral deposits in lands belonging to the United States were open to exploration and purchase. But diamonds were a special case in the public imagination, and the men understood that local land officers and federal officials could still resist a claim if they believed the law did not cover gems. The group moved quickly to make the venture look permanent. Articles were drafted, officers chosen, and directors listed. Offices were fitted out with desks, cabinets, and locks. Clerks were hired in numbers large enough to signal scale, and the sound of paperwork became constant. 20 clerks meant 20 desks filled with letters from men demanding entry, requests for meetings, and inquiries from newspapers. It also meant a workforce that could be ordered to keep quiet, because paychecks create loyalty in a city where rent comes due every month. David Colton was placed where he could run daily operations while the money men stayed above the details. He scheduled meetings, managed correspondence, and gave polite refusals to people who pushed too hard. Visitors were handled carefully. Some were miners with cracked hands and the smell of sweat and tobacco on their clothes. Some were merchants who could write checks and expected doors to open. Some were reporters looking for a name of a place, a boundary line, anything that could be printed. The answer stayed controlled. The company held property of immense value. The company would speak when it was ready. The company would not be stampeded. A corporate shell changed how people behaved. A prospector bragging in a saloon invited trouble. A corporation with officers and letterheads sounded lawful. Shares could be offered. A seal could be pressed into wax. The field could be described as a property instead of a patch of barren ground. That shift mattered in the 1870s. Many men distrusted a miner's word and trusted signed paper, even when the signatures rested on confidence alone. To make the enterprise look solid, the San Francisco side gathered money in a way that sounded measured rather than desperate. 25 prominent men subscribed $80,000 apiece, and their names were spoken in the city as proof that this was not a camp rumor. The subscriptions were organized finance, not a frontier stake. Checks and drafts moved through the bank, and the clerks recorded each transfer with the same care used for shipping receipts and mortgage notes. On paper, the capitalization grew even larger. A charter was prepared that listed capital stock of $10 million divided into 100,000 shares. Stock certificates were printed and stored. A corporate seal was kept under lock. The figures did not mean the company had produced a single stone from the ground, but they changed conversations. A man who hesitated to hand cash to a stranger could be persuaded to buy shares in a corporation whose documents looked official and whose board included respected names. Samuel Latham Mitchell Barlow became the Eastern agent for the operation. He was an attorney with experience in the rooms where capital was raised and reputations were built. Telegrams and letters crossed the continent between his office and Ralston Circle. The writing was cautious. The location of the field was treated as the most valuable secret in the enterprise, and every message was shaped to avoid giving it away. Those who were admitted into the inner circle were counted, and those outside were kept hungry. Money pushed in anyway. Men who had missed the first gold rush, men who had missed early silver, and men who had lost fortunes and wanted a single clean win all pressed for access. The pressure made the directors feel powerful, and it also made them nervous. If stock was sold widely and the venture failed, the lawsuits would be brutal, and the ridicule could destroy careers that had taken decades to build. If stock was not sold and someone else discovered the district and jumped the claim, the men would have paid for secrecy and received nothing. The directors also faced a simpler threat. Philip Arnold and John Slack still controlled the route and the exact ground. They were not bankers. They were not lawyers. They were men who could disappear and sell the secret twice. They had no ties that forced them to honor long-term agreements, and they had no fear of being excluded from polite society in San Francisco or New York. Their advantage was not social. It was practical. They could walk away with a location, and that was enough. The decision to buy them out was made without sentiment. Negotiations were managed by men who were used to closing deals. Arnold talked easily, telling stories that held a room's attention and made listeners believe they were hearing a hard truth from a hard man. Slack spoke less, but his calm manner read as honesty to those who wanted to believe. The company wanted permanent control of the secret. The prospectors wanted money that felt final, and they wanted a promise that made them be described as partners rather than hired guides. The payout was fixed at $300,000 to each man, plus a promised percentage of future profits. The cash alone was an enormous transfer of wealth. In Kentucky farm country, that kind of money could change a man's standing in a single week. It could buy land, pay debts, and command attention in county courts. For the directors, the payout was the price of removing two unpredictable men from the center of the venture. The prospectors did not surrender control gently. They demonstrated the route and the general region only to trusted representatives, and they kept the old habit of misdirection in place. The path they chose was not the straightest line between railroad and field. It bent around landmarks, doubled back on itself, and wasted daylight on purpose. Those choices were useful for more than secrecy. A tired man makes errors. A hungry man loses track of landmarks. A frustrated man stops taking notes. Each detour helped reduce the chance that an observer could later reconstruct the location with confidence. The company absorbed the method and treated it as part of the asset. Once paid, Slack moved out of sight. Arnold returned to Kentucky with a fortune that no longer existed as a promise on a banker's desk. It existed in cash and drafts. Distance offered protection. A man in San Francisco could talk of vengeance, but vengeance has to travel by train and horse, and it has to face local loyalties when it arrives. In the post-war United States, regional politics still shaped outcomes, and local courts did not hurry to satisfy distant anger. With the prospectors removed, the company's managers leaned harder into appearance and organization. They acted as owners and spoke as owners. Office doors opened and shut with formality. Employees were paid. Stationery was printed. Appointments were scheduled. Every routine act built the impression that a real enterprise was underway. Investors and visitors were told that work parties would be sent when the moment was right, and that secrecy was necessary to prevent theft and violence. Legal certainty was pursued at the same time. The investors wanted the federal government to accept that diamonds fell within the mining law's phrase valuable mineral deposits. An inquiry moved through the Department of the Interior and into the Department of Justice. On the 31st day of August, Attorney General George H. Williams issued an official opinion addressing whether title to public lands containing diamonds could be acquired under the Mining Act approved on the 10th day of May. The opinion treated diamonds as within the law's reach. That paper did not put stones in the ground, but it changed how the directors spoke. It could be shown to men who feared that a claim would be rejected on technical grounds. It could be used to reassure Eastern money that the venture was not operating in a legal void. It could also be used to pressure local land officials to accept filings and treat them as ordinary mining business. In a country where paper often mattered as much as possession, the opinion protected the venture in arguments and sales pitches. The directors still refused to name the district. They also refused to sell interest when outsiders offered large sums. David Colton turned away 15 separate proposals, each offering more than $200,000 for claims connected to the venture. Each refusal communicated a message. If men who had already seen the ground refused money of that size, then the true value must be far higher. It was a simple piece of psychology, and it worked because many investors trusted a refusal more than they trusted a promise. Those refusals also bought time. As long as the company could say that rich offers were being rejected, the story signaled success, and questions slowed down. People did not demand proof in the same breath that they were hearing that fortunes were being refused. The culture of speculation rewarded boldness and punished caution, and the directors used that culture as cover. The rumor spread beyond the offices and beyond the two coasts. Newspapers printed pieces that magnified the excitement, and the excitement turned into movement. A letter published in a New York paper signed by someone calling himself an old miner claimed that an enormous stone had been taken from a western diamond field, and it placed the discovery in southwestern Arizona. The location did not match the venture's secret district, but the letter still did damage and still served a purpose. It sent men toward the wrong country, and that confusion helped keep the true ground hidden. Those parties did not travel in comfort. Heat and dust cut throats and eyes. Water was rationed and sometimes stolen. Horses went lame. Wheels broke. Arguments became fights because hunger and fatigue strip away politeness. In mining camps, a rumor could attract men who had nothing left to lose, and men with nothing left to lose were the ones most willing to kill for a claim. The diamond story was already changing the West in that way. It pushed people across territories on the strength of a newspaper line, and it pushed them into dry country where mistakes meant death. European financiers watched as well, because a new American diamond supply threatened established markets and established pricing. The venture placed a representative connected to the Rothschild world among its directors, a choice meant to signal strength and international reach. It also raised the stakes. When names with global weight were attached, the hoax was no longer a San Francisco curiosity. It was a national obsession that touched New York drawing rooms and European counting houses. All of it, the offices, the clerks, the legal opinion, the buyout money, and the men riding toward Arizona rested on a single condition: that the stones on that remote ground had to be natural and the deposit had to be real. Few people demanded immediate verification. A respected engineer had spoken. The Attorney General had written. The directors acted as owners and paid as owners. Those facts were treated as substitutes for evidence. Clarence King watched the enterprise expand and understood what would follow if evidence was never forced into the center. He was trained to measure, map, and test, and he did not protect reputations built on speculation. The list of names attached to the venture told him the collapse would not stay confined to the guilty. It would spread to clerks, smaller investors, and men who had changed their lives on the strength of a story. By the end of August, King had enough to act. He prepared to bring hard-ground truth into a scheme that had been built on paper. October 6, 1872. A government geologist sat in a rail car with a notebook on his knee and listened to men talk loudly in the aisle while the wheels hammered across the rails. Samuel Franklin Emmons wrote in his diary that suspicious-looking characters on the train were returning diamond hunters, and that Henry Janin showed them a few stones, clear crystals that flashed when the car swayed and caught a slice of daylight. Clarence King treated that talk as danger, not entertainment. His survey had crossed the West with compasses, notebooks, and men who measured everything they could reach. The 40th Parallel Survey had mapped and described long belts of country from the Sierra eastward, recording rock layers, coal beds, and metal prospects. The work was funded by Congress and watched by rivals who wanted to cut it down as waste. A real diamond field and ground the survey had already covered would raise one hard question. What else had the survey missed, and why had taxpayers paid for a map that skipped the richest find in America? The rumor had another edge. It carried names that were too large to ignore. William C. Ralston's circle in San Francisco had money and political reach, and their project had already pulled in respected figures in New York. If those men floated stock and the public bought in, the scale of harm would widen beyond a few rich speculators. King had seen how mining booms spread, first through private rooms, then through newspapers, then through wagons packed with men who did not know where they were going but were convinced the earth would reward them. Janin's presence on the train made the problem immediate. Janin was the mining engineer whose report had given the syndicate confidence, and he had personally inspected the secret field in June. If Janin spoke of the deposit with even restrained assurance, men like Ralston would treat it as confirmation. King listened to the way Janin talked, the caution in the words, and he watched the faces of other men who leaned in and tried to pull more from him. The rumor was no longer only a rumor. It was a financial mechanism, and Janin was one of its gears. The men talking diamonds on that train mixed their geography with rail stations and frontier names. They spoke of Rawlins, Rock Springs, Fort Bridger, and Salt Lake City as stepping stones. They spoke of a mesa in the Red Desert near the Colorado and Wyoming line, a piece of ground where gems could be gathered with almost no digging. They also spoke of hunters who had ridden out and come back empty-handed, angry or evasive, men who had wasted money on supplies and travel and now wanted someone else to carry the next risk. King's mind moved the way it moved in the field. He treated words as clues, and he tested them against his own maps and the memory of places his party had surveyed. The 40th Parallel Survey had recently worked in the region that those whispers pointed to, and that made the rumor feel like an accusation. King chose a response that matched the stakes, a quiet investigation that would either prove the deposit or crush it before it reached the public. On October 21st, Emmons and A.D. Wilson, a topographer on King's team, boarded a train from Oakland headed east to Fort Bridger in Wyoming Territory. Their mules had been boarded there for the winter, and Fort Bridger was a practical staging point, a place to gather animals, find packers, and stock food before the rails faded into empty country. King followed the next day. The trip on steel was quick compared to what came after, but the rail ride also carried its own pressure. Every station stop felt like time for rumors to outrun them. At Fort Bridger, the work turned physical and stripped of talk. Packs had to be balanced because a shifted load on a slope spilled gear and broke animals. Flour, bacon, and coffee had to be measured by necessity, not appetite. Water containers had to be checked because a cracked seam meant thirst. Tools were chosen for one purpose: to test ground, not to make camp comfortable. The party that left was small: King, Emmons, Wilson, and 2 packers with the animals. A small party moved faster, made less noise, and left fewer traces for anyone tracking them. A week and a half after Emmons and Wilson left Oakland, after King arrived and supplies were secured, the men started toward the suspected claim. The distance was 150 miles. The season had already turned. Emmons later described the journey as bitterly cold, and the land offered little shelter across long stretches. Wind came hard across open desert and cut through wool. Water froze in canteens and on the rim of tin cups. At night the ground held no warmth, and the men slept stiff, waking to boots that felt like boards. The landscape did not offer the relief that prospectors like to imagine. It was not a forested valley with a stream for gold panning. It was wide, dry country broken by ridges and shallow gulches, a place where a rider could see far and still find no help. The men rode with discipline, keeping their route aligned to what they had deduced from fieldwork and clues, watching the ground for signs that others had been there. In a fraud built on secrecy, any trace mattered: a broken stake, a scrap of paper, a boot print where no one should have walked. After 5 days, they made camp and began looking immediately. They were not alone in the wilderness. The first clear marker was a claim notice posted by Henry Janin. In that empty country, a nailed notice looked like a legal voice hammered into silence. It told King that the company's people had been there with intent, and that the place had been treated as a mine even before it became one. They followed additional posted notices until they reached a bare, iron-stained strip of coarse sandstone exposed on the surface, a low run of rock that stretched for 100 feet. It did not look like a bonanza. It looked like plain ground with a bruise of rust color. The men dropped their reins and went down on hands and knees. Emmons found a small ruby quickly. Then more stones appeared, tiny points of color and light, and then the first diamonds. Cold slowed their fingers, and the gems were small enough to slip from numb hands. For a short time, the field worked on them the way it had worked on bankers and engineers, by letting them find treasure with almost no effort. The human mind reacts to easy wealth with a physical rush. Men in the open desert began thinking in city numbers without speaking them aloud. The first day ended with pockets heavier than reason allowed, and with an excitement that crept into sleep. Emmons recorded later that the party dreamed of wealth that could be gathered, the kind of dream that comes after a day of winning. Morning broke the spell. King noticed a pattern that did not belong to natural deposits. Wherever a diamond appeared, clusters of rubies appeared with it. The pairing repeated too cleanly. Diamonds and rubies did not share a single origin. They formed under different conditions and in different kinds of host rock. A genuine deposit did not scatter them together in neat handful ratios on a surface strip of sandstone. The mix on that ridge resembled a jeweler's assortment poured onto the earth, not a miner's strike. The second pattern was even simpler and more damning. Gems appeared only in disturbed ground. Where the crust was intact, hard, and unbroken, the surface held nothing. Where the crust had been scuffed, cracked, or poked, stones appeared. Wind did not sort diamonds into footprints. Rain did not gather rubies into scuffed patches while leaving untouched ground sterile. The distribution followed human movement. Then they studied anthills. In a real deposit, anthills would be random mounds of grit. Here, rubies appeared in anthills that were surrounded by footprints. Anthills that lacked tracks and whose crust showed no extra breaks held no rubies at all. In the anthills that did show tracks, the crust beside the main exit hole had a second small break, the kind made by a stick pressed into hard ground. Emmons wrote the conclusion in field language. Someone had pushed stones into the mound. Once that became clear, the men changed their behavior. They stopped hunting and started testing. They spent the next 2 days doing work designed to expose fraud. They dug where diamonds should have been distributed below the surface if the deposit was genuine. They cut a trench 10 feet deep in a gulch where a natural spread of stones would place gems through layers, not only on top. They sifted the dirt they pulled up and examined it with the same attention they used for ore samples. The trench produced no diamonds at all. The fraud had a practical structure. The stones were on top because a person had put them on top. The variety of stones was wrong because the salter had bought whatever could be purchased, not what the earth could make in one place. The patchiness was wrong because a man can seed an acre by hand, but a man cannot seed a desert the same way and keep his story secret. The posted notices did not prove riches. They proved a determination to turn paper into proof. On their 4th day at the site, another figure arrived, and the visitor's behavior confirmed that the hoax had already become a market. A man rode up on horseback, stout, city-dressed, and visibly out of keeping with the surroundings. He asked if they had found any carrots. When one of King's men blurted out that the field was salted, the rider reacted with a gambler's interest and spoke of profit, the chance to sell short on the company's stock. He introduced himself as J.F. Barry, a New York diamond dealer. Barry had not wandered in by accident. He had followed King's party from Fort Bridger and watched them with a spyglass from the top of a nearby butte. The spyglass detail mattered. It meant other men were hunting the location and that they were willing to shadow a government survey party to get it. It meant the truth, once spoken, could be turned into a weapon, and it meant the company's secret ground had already leaked into outside hands. That evening, King decided to leave the field at once. He later wrote that he intended to go straight to San Francisco to learn the status of the company and prevent further transactions in the stock. The presence of Barry added pressure. If Barry carried the news first, he could shape it, sell it, or use it to profit from the collapse. King chose speed over another week of field notes and samples. Before dawn, King and Wilson rode 45 miles to Black Butte Station across desert and mountain with no road to follow. Darkness hid holes and loose rock. A stumble was enough to break a leg. Wind cut their faces raw, and every minute spent still made the cold bite deeper. They rode with the stubborn focus of men who understood that delay meant damage. When they reached the station, their mouths were cracked from cold air and their hands shook when they tried to work straps and buttons. The rails carried them west. On November 10, 1872, King arrived in San Francisco and went directly to Henry Jannen's hotel. Jannen had written the report that had enabled the company to form, and Jannen had watched influential men and politicians attach their names to it. King knew that explaining the fraud would require more than an accusation. It would require proof arranged into a sequence that pride could not dismiss. King spent nearly the entire night detailing what had been found: the disturbed crust, the anthills, the empty trench, and the human pattern beneath the sparkle. On November 11th, 1872, King put his findings into an official letter addressed to the company's board of directors. The letter was written for publication. It called the fields utterly valueless and described the directors as victims of an unparalleled fraud. It also explained the tests and observations in the plain language of a man who expected to be challenged. That same morning, King and Janin went to William C. Ralston's office at the Bank of California. The directors were there, men who controlled large sums and who were used to turning risk into profit. King did not soften the message. He read the letter aloud. He described the field tests, the way stones appeared only where the crust had been disturbed, the anthills that held rubies only when footprints and crust breaks surrounded them, and the trench that produced nothing at depth. He forced the men to face the simple fact that geology did not behave like their hopes. The reaction was shock, then fear, then calculation. One director suggested delay, the idea that money could be made by holding the news back for a few days. That suggestion showed what the hoax had awakened even in a bank office, the instinct to turn any turn of events into profit. King shut the idea down. He stated that there was not enough money in the Bank of California to make him delay publication a single hour. The directors agreed to stop a planned stock sale, 100,000 shares offered at $100 a share. That planned sale, if carried out, would have reached beyond the insiders and into the public. Halting it was self-protection, and a line drawn against wider harm. The directors still wanted their own confirmation, and they wanted a way to present the exposure as an act of responsibility, not only a humiliation. They pressed King to lead a second inspection party back to the field with company representatives present. King agreed. General David Colton, who had become the company's general manager 3 weeks earlier, joined the group with Janin and others. They left the next day. The second trip was harsher than the first. Cold was severe enough that men reported whiskey freezing in the bottle. The country punished them the same way it punished everyone, with wind and distance and night cold that settled into bones. At the site, the field did not brighten under scrutiny. It degraded. The inspection party saw planted stones where stone should not hold them, gems scattered on bare rock and pressed into crevices, props left by hands that had already run. The place no longer looked like a mine. It looked like a stage after actors had fled, the scenery still in place and the trick now obvious. Colton absorbed it with the blunt logic of a man who knew the difference between a fortification and a painted wall. On November 25th, 1872, Colton reported back to the directors that he had seen rubies scattered on bare rock in a way nature could not accomplish. With Colton's confirmation and with King's letter ready, the directors voted to publish the exposure and dissolve the company. They had been pulled into a fraud that threatened their money and their names, and they chose to cut it loose before it could reach the public through a stock offering. On November 26, 1872, the San Francisco Chronicle ran the story with stacked headlines that began with "Unmasked." The news moved fast by wire, and the Associated Press carried it outward. Newspapers focused on the humiliation of powerful men, the fact that bankers, politicians, and a respected mining engineer had been fooled by stones pushed into the skin of a desert. Public laughter rose. But there was also relief that the trap had been sprung before a 100,000 share offering could spread the damage. The mesa and the sandstone did not change. What changed was the market built on the lie. A rumor that had traveled by whisper and private meeting now traveled by print and telegram. A hoax that had relied on secrecy and controlled access was stripped open by field tests, by an empty trench cut 10 feet deep, and by the plain fact that rubies appeared only where a boot had scuffed the crust. The fraud's power broke when the story met a man who treated it as evidence to be tested, not a dream to be sold. November 27, 1872 came with an aftershock that did not stop at the edge of San Francisco. The Chronicle's unmasked story had already been wired outward, and once the Telegraph carried it, there was no longer a private version of events and a public version. There was only the public version, a bare statement that a diamond field celebrated in closed rooms had been salted by human hands, and that powerful men had been fooled on a patch of desert where gems appeared only where boots had scuffed the crust. In San Francisco, the news hit different neighborhoods in different ways. On the waterfront, longshoremen read it as entertainment and as confirmation that rich men could be made to look stupid. In saloons on Pacific Street, the story was repeated with laughter and additions, each teller sharpening the humiliation. In more respectable bars near Montgomery Street, laughter was quieter, because men there understood that a financial scandal could spill into bank runs, credit tightening, and wage cuts. In offices above street level, clerks heard doors slam and voices rise behind frosted glass. Partners who had spoken confidently only days earlier now spoke in clipped low tones as if the walls carried ears. The syndicate directors moved quickly to protect themselves. Dissolving the company was only the beginning. Their next task was controlling the narrative in a way that prevented a stampede against their other interests. If depositors believed the Bank of California had gambled recklessly, they could pull money and create panic that had nothing to do with diamonds. William C. Ralston, therefore, had to present the exposure as an act of responsibility. He needed the public to believe that he had been careful, that he had hired an engineer, that he had sought an Eastern appraisal, and that he had stopped a stock sale the moment credible scientific doubt appeared. That explanation was not purely defensive. It was also true in the narrow sense that men had tried to build a chain of verification. The trouble was that each verification step had been designed inside a secrecy system controlled by the con men. The engineer's report had been shaped by a staged demonstration. The Tiffany valuation had certified only the stone's nature, not their origin. The legal opinion from the Attorney General had addressed land law, not geology. When the public heard those details, many understood what the syndicate hoped they would not. That paper and authority had been used as substitutes for a hard test that should have come first. Newspapers across the country sharpened the lesson with aggressive writing. Eastern papers described the scheme as frontier trickery that had trapped city men with too much money and too much vanity. Western papers, including those in mining towns, treated it as both comedy and warning because miners recognized how easily proof could be purchased and staged. Some editorials focused on Arnold and Slack as villains, but many focused on the directors as willing victims, men who wanted a miracle so badly that they built a machine to protect the miracle from scrutiny until it was too late. The naming of names mattered. When reporters printed lists of directors and prominent subscribers, the story gained a second life as social ammunition. A man who had lost money in the venture might not be pitied if he was rich and well-connected. He might be mocked. Rival bankers could whisper that their competitor had been duped. Political enemies could hint at corruption. The scandal gave every rival a tool. In New York, the reaction carried a colder tone. The city's financial culture had long practice at consuming scandals and turning them into advantage. Men who had been invited into the diamond circle but had refused could now point to their refusal as proof of judgment. Lawyers immediately began asking which contracts could be attacked and which signatures could be defended. Brokers watched for any stock that might be connected indirectly to the venture and considered whether prices would swing. Samuel Latham Mitchell Barlow faced a particular kind of professional risk. He had anchored the Eastern structure, drafted documents, and brought respected Eastern names close enough to be touched by the scandal. He was not being accused of salting a desert, but he was being associated with a reckless enterprise. Barlow moved fast to emphasize that he had relied on a professional engineer's report and a Tiffany valuation. and that the directors had halted a public stock offering once Clarence King's scientific findings were known. In that framing, Barlow's reputation would be damaged less by gullibility and more by being caught in a fraud that had deceived other qualified men first. Henry Janin faced worse. Engineers lived on credibility. An engineer whose report could be made to look foolish risked losing future work. Janin's defenders argued that he had been guided under the discoverer's rules, that the field had produced stones under his own hands, and that he had acted as any reasonable engineer would act when presented with apparent evidence. His critics pointed to the unnatural mixture of gems and the shallow distribution that should have triggered skepticism. The public did not need to understand mineral genesis to grasp one simple point: an expert had certified a thing that the expert later admitted was fake. That stain did not wash off quickly. Janin's own behavior added fuel. On the train to Rawlins after the first inspection, he had shown stones to curious diamond hunters, and that casual display had helped spread the story beyond the syndicate. Now, after King's exposure, the same habit made Janin look careless. Even if he had not intended to promote the company, the image was easy to use in print: an engineer flashing gems to strangers on a train, while his report carried weight in boardrooms. In San Francisco, the directors' first practical problem was recovery. They wanted their money back, and they wanted the men who had taken it. Philip Arnold and John Slack had already been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars each. That money was no longer sitting in a company safe. It had been converted into drafts and carried out of the state. The syndicate's lawyers understood that chasing a man across state lines was not simple, especially when the man had returned to a rural region where local sympathy could protect him. Legal instruments existed, but enforcement was uneven, and public officials did not always hurry to serve the needs of distant financiers. Investigators were sent anyway. They moved quietly at first because the syndicate did not want to look desperate. A desperate victim invites more ridicule. The investigators asked questions in hotels and at railroad depots. They spoke with people who had seen Arnold and Slack pass through. They tried to trace drafts and bank transfers. They examined the assumed names used in London and the purchase records of rough stones. Each small piece of evidence strengthened the story's outline, that the discoverers had used real gems purchased through legitimate channels to create the appearance of a miraculous deposit. In Kentucky, Arnold's return created a different kind of noise. Rural communities noticed sudden wealth. A man who had been a modest farmer and returned with the ability to buy land and pay cash would draw eyes. He could not hide his wealth unless he chose to live like a poor man, and Arnold did not. He purchased a farm and began living in a way that reflected his new status. That visibility provided a target for investigators, but it also gave Arnold protection. Local people who saw a neighbor become rich often treated outside accusations as envy rather than evidence, especially when the accusers were distant bankers. The syndicate considered direct confrontation. Angry men discussed whether force could be used to recover money. Those discussions stayed mostly in the realm of talk, because taking force across the country risked criminal charges and greater scandal. Still, the anger was real. In San Francisco's harder circles, violence was not theoretical. Men had been killed over much smaller sums. The fact that Arnold and Slack had slipped away with fortunes while respected names stood exposed made the insult feel personal. The public also demanded a villain. When a scandal breaks, people want a face to blame, and they prefer a simple explanation over a complicated system of greed, secrecy, and staged verification. Arnold and Slack served that need. Their Kentucky background, their rough manner, and their claim of secret travel through dangerous country fit the archetype of frontier tricksters. Newspapers described them in harsh language. Cartoons suggested country fools and city fools in the same frame. The story became not only a crime tale but a morality play about appetite and humiliation. West's mining towns absorbed the lesson differently. Some miners argued that the directors deserved it because they had sought a monopoly and had tried to keep the discovery from ordinary prospectors. In that view, the hoax was a punishment for exclusion. Others argued that the hoax damaged the credibility of every legitimate mining claim because investors now had a new reason to distrust Western ventures. That distrust could cut off capital for real mines, leaving camps starving for equipment and payroll. Both views contain truth. A large fraud does not only harm its direct victims, it harms the trust that allows real ventures to be financed. In the scientific world, Clarence King's action gained attention. Newspapers portrayed him as the man who saved the public from a massive stock swindle. That portrayal helped him politically because survey work depended on congressional support, and congressional support depended on public belief that the surveys provided value. The exposure also strengthened the idea that scientific expertise, when used independently, could restrain speculation. That idea mattered in the late 19th century, when the West's development was tied to mineral claims and to the credibility of the men describing them. Yet the scandal also exposed a weakness in expertise. Janine had been an expert and he had been fooled. The public could easily conclude that experts were unreliable, or that experts could be purchased. That suspicion grew because Janin had been offered stock at a low price, a financial tie that made him look compromised even if he believed he was merely being compensated. The tension between public trust and financial incentives became part of the scandal's residue. Inside the dissolved company, small investors and clerks faced the harshest consequences. The directors could absorb losses even if it hurt. Smaller participants could not. A clerk who had borrowed money to buy a few shares could be ruined. A minor investor who had leveraged a property could lose it. These people did not get invited into private meetings where decisions were made. They heard rumors, saw respected names attached, and believed the scheme was safe enough. When the exposure hit, they had no cushion. Arguments over responsibility filled rooms across the city. Some insisted that any man who bought into a secret enterprise deserved the risk. Others argued that respected men had a duty not to use their names to sell a story they had not tested thoroughly. The debates were not abstract. They influenced whether lawsuits would be filed and whether settlements might be offered to avoid prolonged public examination. By December 1872, the legal machinery began turning. Complaints were drafted. Demands were sent. Lawyers began collecting affidavits and assembling a record of payments, meetings, and claims. The syndicate wanted the courts to treat the matter as fraud and theft, not as an ordinary speculative loss. That required proving intent. It required showing that Arnold and Slack had planted gems and sold a location they knew was fake. Clarence King's field observations pointed strongly in that direction. But field observations still needed to be tied to the men who had handled the stones. The London purchase under assumed names became central. If it could be shown that the same men who claimed to have found a natural field had purchased large quantities of rough stones in Europe, the court would see preparation rather than luck. Testimony from the London diamond merchant could provide that link. Documents of sale and identity, even under assumed names, could be connected back through travel records and witnesses. The scheme's logistics, once unmasked, became a chain that could be followed. That chain also revealed a deeper point the public began to understand. The hoax had not succeeded because Arnold and Slack were clever alone. It had succeeded because powerful men built a protective structure around them. Secrecy, selective access, blindfolded routes, closed-door meetings, corporate paper, and respected appraisals all work together to delay the simplest question: does the ground itself contain gems in a natural way? Through December, the story remained alive in print. Each new paper added a detail, Each retelling sharpened the humiliation or the moral lesson. Men in saloons still laughed, but the laughter shifted into caution in some places. A miner in a camp might still chase a rumor, but he might demand to see a deposit worked for more than an hour first. An investor in a city might still fund a Western venture, but he might insist on independent inspection. The fraud's reach began changing behavior, not by making people virtuous, but by making them fear being ridiculed. Arnold and Slack remained out of reach as the year closed. Their money had been converted into land and comfort. Their names had become symbols in a national story. The directors in San Francisco had dissolved the company and tried to halt the most damaging public stock sale. Clarence King had done his part by exposing the field and forcing the truth into print. The question left hanging as 1872 ended was not whether the hoax had occurred. The question was whether the men who built it would ever face a courtroom, or whether the story would end the way many Western stories ended, with the guilty living quietly under another sky while the victims argued in offices and newspapers over how they had been made to believe. December 6, 1872. A New York Times piece ran with the smug tone of a city that enjoyed watching San Francisco stumble. It pointed out that men known for sharp dealing had been taken in by a diamond field that did not exist. In California, the line hit hard because it turned private loss into a public joke, and it did it in the same breath that accused the West of being naive, reckless, and greedy. The directors who had already admitted the fraud now had to live through a second punishment, the nation treating their mistake as entertainment. California papers answered the Eastern sneer with their own anger. Carson City's new Daily Appeal described the country as hornswoggled, and other editors treated the affair as a warning that a clever salting operation could make even hard ground appear rich to the impatient. In San Francisco, the Chronicle called it the most gigantic swindle of the age, and the phrase spread because it matched the scale of the embarrassment and the simplicity of the trick. In San Francisco, the men tied to the venture moved fast to shut doors and stop the bleeding. The offices that had been opened to handle correspondence, land papers, and subscriptions no longer had a purpose. Desks that had held maps and drafting tools now held stacks of angry letters. Clerks who had been hired to copy ledgers were told to gather their pay and leave. The telegraph lines that had carried excited messages now carried warnings and legal demands. Messengers ran between Montgomery Street and law offices, carrying sealed packets instead of celebratory notes. Refunds became a form of damage control. The directors had taken in large sums, and the simplest way to reduce fury was to return whatever cash still sat in accounts that had not yet been spent on surveys, travel, guards, or speculative preparations. Refund checks did not restore pride, but they created paperwork that could be shown later as proof of responsibility. Each refund also separated an investor from the group's next move, turning a crowd into individuals, and individuals were easier to manage than mobs. The larger question was how to pursue the discoverers without extending the story. A public trial would place directors under oath and force them to explain why they had relied on secrecy, why they had accepted a blindfolded expedition, why they had treated a jeweler's valuation as proof of a deposit, and why they had allowed themselves to imagine that a handful of men could control the diamond supply of the world. A trial would also invite every rival banker in California to watch and smile. The directors wanted money back, but they also wanted the noise to die. The first formal step came through the machinery of local justice. A grand jury in San Francisco indicted Philip Arnold and John Slack for fraud. The indictment did not mean a jail cell. It meant that names were written on paper, charges were described, and the state's authority existed as a threat. It also meant that the matter could be used as leverage in private talks, a reminder that the state could turn the scandal into criminal punishment if negotiations failed. The contents of that indictment were never revealed publicly, which kept the record thin and protected influential men from having their worst decisions recited line by line. Arnold was not in California when the indictment landed. He was in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, back in the social world where he was known not as a Western adventurer, but as a neighbor. He had returned with enough money to buy security, and he spent it in ways that made him easy to locate. He bought a 2-story brick house. He bought a large spread of farmland nearby. And he put the property in his wife Mary's name. Deeds were recorded in county books with ink that did not fade. A man can hide in the West with a horse and a rifle, but a man cannot hide from paper when the paper is locked into a courthouse. Once the fraud became public, Arnold's new prosperity became part of the evidence against him. Kentucky towns had their own language for sudden wealth. They watched what a man repaired first, whether he paid cash, whether he bought land instead of renting, and whether his family began living behind brick rather than timber. People asked how a former hatter's apprentice and small-time trader had found such fortune. Those questions were not spoken in court, but they mattered because they shaped how willing locals were to help him and how willing they were to accept that he had earned his money honestly. Pressure arrived in the form of lawyers and letters, not armed men. California investors had resources. They could hire detectives who understood rail schedules and shipping records. They could pay to copy courthouse deeds. They could send counsel who knew how to speak to a local judge and how to present claims without waving a pistol. Arnold's defense was not violence, it was denial. He insisted that he had been honest, that he had shown a real deposit, and that someone else must have salted the ground after he had left. The best evidence against that denial came from commerce. The hoax had depended on real gems planted in the soil, which meant those gems had been purchased somewhere. Once investigators began treating the fraud like a supply chain rather than a wilderness mystery, the focus shifted from sandstone to paper. Merchants keep records. Shipping agents note crates. Customs officials and port workers remember unusual cargoes. Jewel dealers do not forget buyers who spend large sums on rough stones and ask questions that do not fit the ordinary business of jewelry. Testimony and papers pointed to London. In July of 1871, Arnold and Slack purchased rough diamonds and rubies from a London diamond merchant named Leopold Keller. They did not buy a few stones, they bought thousands, a bulk lot that made sense only if the stones were intended as material, not as jewelry. Keller later testified that one of the men asked where the diamonds would be cut, a question that sounded normal until the buyers offered no plan for cutting at all. They were not investing in gems for sale, they were purchasing props for a claim. Those purchases were made under false names. Arnold used the name Oundel. Slack used his middle name Bircham. The use of assumed names mattered because it showed intent. It also provided a trail because men who use aliases often repeat small habits, the way they sign a receipt, the way they speak of themselves, the way they travel. When the Keller transaction surfaced, it replaced argument with fact. If Arnold had purchased rough stones in London before the supposed discovery, then the claim of innocent surprise could not stand. That London trail also embarrassed American institutions that had been treated as unassailable. Charles Tiffany's valuation had been treated as a seal, and newspapers had repeated the fact that a prestigious New York jeweler had examined the stones. After the collapse, the same line was turned against Tiffany, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as proof that even famous expertise could be used as stage dressing. Tiffany's firm had looked at gems, not geology. It had said the stones were genuine. It had never declared that a desert deposit existed, yet the public treated the valuation as though it had done exactly that. The directors responded the way powerful men often respond when they are caught looking foolish. They tried to compress the scandal into a short window and then bury it under new business. They admitted the hoax once the federal surveyor's finding became undeniable. and then they aimed to end the matter with refunds and private claims rather than public speeches. They did not tour the country defending themselves. They did not publish long arguments in papers. They kept their voices low and let time do the work that pride could not do. Litigation still came. William Lent pursued recovery aggressively. He had lost a large sum and he did not accept being mocked as a fool. He filed suit against Arnold seeking money back. The suit forced Arnold to confront the reality that his Kentucky respectability could not shield him from California claims. It also forced him to decide whether to fight and prolong the case or to settle and reduce risk. Each day the suit remained active was another day a reporter could call it news. Settlement became the practical route. Arnold settled out of court with investors. The fact of settlement did not mean he admitted guilt in public, but it meant he paid money to end claims. The settlement also fit the investors' priorities because it returned some funds without forcing a trial that would refresh every humiliating detail. In effect, both sides bought silence, and both sides knew what the silence cost. Slack did not provide the same target. California authorities did not bring him to trial. With one partner tied to land in Kentucky and the other outside the reach of easy pressure, the legal story ended unevenly. A fraud built by two men ended with only one of them paying money back in settlement, and neither of them facing a full criminal proceeding in open court. The absence of a courtroom ending left readers with the same sour taste that followed many frontier crimes. Clever men escaped while honest people learned the lesson. The press filled the gap left by the courts. Newspapers that had praised the discovery now ran bitter headlines. Editorial writers mocked the idea that a blindfolded trip had ever been acceptable. Cartoonists drew bankers with magnifying glasses pressed to their eyes while con men poured glitter into sand. The public enjoyed the spectacle, but the public also absorbed a lesson. Wealth did not guarantee caution, and prestige did not guarantee truth. Across the West, the fraud fed a rush for gems that burned hot and then cooled. Men with no training in mineral deposits walked dry washes and scraped hillsides, convinced that diamonds could lie on the surface like beans. Some of them went hungry in the process, spending their last dollars on transport and provisions and returning with nothing but dust and sunburn. Trading posts sold shovels, sacks, and cheap sieves to people who had read a headline and believed it. When the truth caught up, the anger did not find Arnold and Slack. It found the next salesman, the next rumor, and the next promoter who promised treasure under a stranger's boots. The hoax also changed how salting was discussed. Salting had existed before, but the diamond swindle made it famous enough that city investors learned the word. Mining engineers began insisting on stricter sampling. They demanded to see stones in a geological context, not simply in a sack. They demanded to observe how material was recovered. They pressed for deeper test pits and for samples taken under controlled supervision with witnesses who were not paid by the seller. These measures were not moral reforms, they were defensive routines built to prevent humiliation. Men who had been publicly humiliated responded by hiring more experts, and experts responded by protecting themselves. Engineers began writing clearer reports that described exactly what they had examined and what they had not. Appraisers learned to state the limits of their work. The stones were real, the stones were valuable, but the origin claimed by a seller was a separate question. This careful language reduced future liability and also reduced the chance that a single assessment could be used as a weapon in a sales pitch. The federal government gained influence from the episode. Clarence King and his survey colleagues had not been hired by investors. They were part of a government project that mapped and evaluated resources. Their exposure of the fraud was presented as public service. For the scientific community, it became proof that field knowledge mattered as much as city expertise. For Congress, it became an argument for funding surveys because surveys could prevent private greed from becoming national embarrassment. King's personal career benefited. His reputation had been at risk because the diamond field lay in country his teams had studied. By demonstrating that the deposit was fraudulent, he turned a threat into a triumph. Newspapers praised him as a man who had protected capital and common sense. He became known outside scientific circles, and that visibility later mattered when government structure changed, and scientific leadership became a political decision. The institutional change became concrete in 1879. Congress created the United States Geological Survey to unify and coordinate work that had previously been split among multiple survey efforts. President Rutherford B. Hayes nominated Clarence King to be the first director on March 20, 1879. The Senate confirmed the nomination on April 3rd. King took the oath of office on May 24th. He served as director through 1881. The episode that had begun as a confidence trick in the desert now fed into a national system designed to verify claims in the ground before those claims could become public catastrophe. San Francisco's financial world did not move cleanly forward. William Chapman Ralston, the Bank of California leader tied to the diamond venture, faced a later crisis tied to a broader pattern of speculation and leverage. On August 27, 1875, hours after being asked to resign as president of the Bank of California, Ralston was found drowned in San Francisco Bay. The drowning did not repair losses or restore confidence. It became another grim event attached to an era that rewarded audacity and punished failure without mercy. Back in Kentucky, Arnold's attempt to convert swindle money into respectability followed a harsh route. In 1873, he entered banking. He used his wealth to buy into a financial institution and put his name into local commerce. The move placed him back into rivalry and grudges where personal disputes could turn violent. In 1878, a quarrel with another banker escalated into a shootout in Elizabethtown that injured bystanders. Arnold took a shotgun blast in the shoulder. He lingered while the wound healed, and then pneumonia cut him down months later. He was 49 years old, and the money he kept left unanswered questions regarding the full amount that vanished into his private life. The hoax left a lingering mark on paper maps and on the habits of men who financed the West. The mesa near the Wyoming and Colorado line remained barren of natural diamonds, yet the label Diamond Field remained on United States Geological Survey topographic maps. The name did not celebrate a deposit, it recorded a warning. It told later readers that a place can become famous for deception, and that the greed of a few men can stamp a false story onto national memory for generations.